Welcome everybody, and Matt's not in the room. We'll wait for Matt. Oh, there he is in the room. I see. He's been in the room all along. I want to welcome everybody, and thanks for taking the time to come to this community information meeting tonight to discuss the Pall Gelman cleanup plans. It is being jointly hosted by the Technical Outreach Services for Communities, which has got the acronym TOSC, City of Ann Arbor, and Scio Residents for Safe Water. My name is Roger Rail. I'm Vice Chair of Scio Residents for Safe Water. Scio Residents for Safe Water is a grassroots group, a watchdog group that formed to monitor the Pall Gelman problem, and it's been doing that for about 10 years now. The SRSW website is really easy. It's www.srsw.org, and you can learn more about the situation here with the Gelman cleanup, and also it has links to several other sites that give you more information. Over the years, citizen volunteers have really made a difference on this site and have kept tabs on cleanup activities and helped us move forward toward an effective, protective, and community acceptable cleanup. And we're hoping that some of you new people here tonight can continue that effort, because it's going to take all of us working together to make sure that the right kind of cleanup happens and that we're not passing the cost and risks of the cleanup on to the citizens and local governments, that those costs and risks stay with the polluter. Tonight in this meeting, we'll start by gathering questions from all of you. Write them down under the, we haven't got any headings up here yet, but we have suggested headings of things like technical, community development, legal, statutory, categories like that. We're going to try to write them down into categories. And after we take all the questions for a period of time, then we're going to have a prepared presentation by Larry Lemke, who's going to answer some of those questions in his presentation. There'll be a break. There'll be time for more questions and follow-up. There'll be a little bit more presentation. And then the last part of the meeting, the bulk of it's going to be question and answer discussion, to make sure we try to answer as many of the questions as possible. For the questions that can't be adequately addressed tonight, we'll try to lay out some procedures to get them answered for you, or tell you how to get them answered and share with the rest of the people. The immediate goal is to get as many of you up to date on the issues as possible so that you can more effectively influence cleanup plans, including the currently proposed cleanup plan that have a public comment period that ends on, I think it's Monday, isn't it? August 9th. So it's a real tight constraint here. But that's our goal tonight, is to try to get you up to speed so you can at least comment on that plan. And then the other issues we'll try to get you as a community, keep you informed with future meetings and future involvement. Now, this meeting is being taped by CTN for later replay, but we plan to deliver a tape of the meeting to DEQ by the August 9th deadline as part of the public comment to the proposed cleanup plans. So whatever you say tonight will also be part of your public comment, but we encourage you to put it in writing, either in a letter or an email as addition to that. Now here is Matt Nod, who's the City of Ann Arbor's environmental coordinator, who will say a few words about community participation.
Thank you. Again, welcome, and thanks for coming tonight. Again, thanks to TOSC for helping us through the last year or so, especially Roger, Scio Residents for Safe Water, NIPD, the other neighborhood group that's involved. I guess I would like to talk a little bit about what I do at the city and some of the mechanisms we have at the city for you to participate. I'm the environmental coordinator for the City of Ann Arbor. I'm in the administrator's office. Myself and Dave Conkle, who's the energy coordinator, our job is to make recommendations to the administrator, mayor, council on environmental and energy policy at the city. I'm the point person for the Pall Gelman contamination. I also work on Arm & Cleaners issues. You know, we had a big EPA study go on there last year. Number of other issues in the city. I staff something called the Environmental Commission. It's 11 appointed citizens. Rita Locke Caruso is our current chairperson. We are live on television on CTN every fourth Thursday of the month. And people do come up to me. Some people watch. But that's a group that is appointed by City Council to make recommendations on environmental policies to our City Council. And they've done so for a phosphorus ordinance, idling, brownfields, a number of major environmental issues in the city. And that's a mechanism. We have public commentary. I see Margie Teal here. She's a City Council person who's also on the Environmental Commission. I try to put the majority of the MDQ and our comments on the Pall issue up on the city's website. So if you go to the main city website, it's a2gov.org, and you look under departments, you'll see Environment Energy, and that'll bring up my webpage. And there's a link to 1,4-dioxane. There's a link to the Environmental Commission with emails, my emails on there. You can feel free to email me anytime. Also, one of the things we've set up with an outside group called Huron Valley Community Network, hvcn.org. But if you go to my website, there's a email subscription list, so that if you click on that and send an email to this website, it will automatically log your email, and every time there's a public meeting on this, an environmental commission meeting, I use it for general environmental issues at the city, but virtually all the Pall information I will announce through that subscription list. So I would recommend, if you have email and it's something you want to stay on top of, that's a good way to stay involved, because I'll announce when the state sends out a comment or some big change has happened locally. I'm interested, again, as Roger said, to hear any of your questions, but I'm also interested in how you want to continue to participate. There's a long history here. I've spent the last 3 years working on this issue, and I still don't understand everything. But there's a lot of ways that, if you're interested in the background, the history, the science, we can set up meetings at City Hall. You know, I can invite me to neighborhood groups. I've gone out and spoken twice to all the Reinhardt realtors, because they had a number of questions about, what do we tell people if they're interested in buying a house in that area? So I'm available. Don't hesitate to call me, email me, invite me to the neighborhoods. The city would like to figure out a way to be helpful as you organize around this issue. Again, there's public commentary at the commission meetings that you're welcome to use. I'm going to stop there, but again, either tonight, if you have thoughts on the ways you think we can be helpful, I can be helpful, let me know, or do it offline through an email or call me. So, yes?
What did you tell the real estate people when people asked them?
I basically told them the facts, and I mean, that's not what this meeting's about, but you know, that for the most part, if you're buying a house on the west side, it's 200 feet underground. And these are all the things that you're not exposed by doing. People are worried that if they go to garden, they're exposed to this. That's not the case. So there's a lot of misinformation out there that people call me and they think because they're in a certain part of the area, that's where their drinking water comes from. And that's not the case. We mix all the drinking water from the river and the other well that we use in the city, and everybody gets the same water. So there's just some misconceptions out there, and that's what I try and do. And then they know that they can call me, and any of the people that they're working with call me, or Mike Gephardt, I think, gets a lot of phone calls about people who are interested in the issues and buying houses. So I'll leave it at that and introduce Kirk from TOSC.
Thanks, Matt. Once again, my name is Kirk Riley, and I'm the TOSC program manager at Michigan State. We've heard a lot of thanks tonight from Matt and Roger for various parties that have helped the city and helped SRSW on this issue. We really owe a debt of gratitude to the involvement of the city of Ann Arbor and members of SRSW, and really citizens of the city of Ann Arbor who've been more involved lately through a group called NIPD, Neighbors Impacted by Pall Dioxane. And I want to thank you once again for coming out tonight to hear from us about this important issue. This is really a critical time in this issue in that we're in the middle of a public comment period on the proposals that have been submitted by Pall Life Sciences and that have also been submitted by Michigan DEQ. Michigan DEQ, as you'll hear more about tonight, has submitted their preferred remedial alternative, and we're here tonight to provide an independent examination that the TOSC program has carried out of both the Pall plan and the preferred remedial alternative of Michigan DEQ. I'd like to give you a little bit of context so that you can understand how we've come here tonight. But this is the second meeting that the TOSC program has held on this issue. I recognize a lot of faces, and we were at last week's meeting as well, so I don't want to spend a lot of time telling you about the TOSC program, but I do have one introductory slide. If I can get back to it, there we go. We've been around since 1994 providing technical assistance to communities that have serious pollution problems. Been doing this work for 10 years under a grant primarily from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. We do receive some supplemental funding from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, or MDEQ, to provide this same sort of assistance. But we do receive funding from them, but really we are a group of academic researchers, and it's a national program. And we really are independent of these funding agencies, and we really do have latitude to present an independent perspective or an independent analysis of these issues. The focus is, and there was a lot of material out on the table that you picked up on the way in, the focus is to educate and provide what we call technical assistance, and by technical assistance I mean reviewing technical documents and providing an outside opinion on those technical documents. But we really, as you might imagine, being from a university, we think it's important that you as a community understand this issue better. You have an independent perspective on it that can help, but it's really important. Roger stressed at the outset that this is going to be an ongoing issue in this community, and it's important that you understand the state of knowledge and have some sense of what the solutions that are under consideration and what the best solutions are, or perhaps the best range of solutions that might be available for this issue. We have an agreement with Scio Residents for Safe Water and the City of Ann Arbor to provide these services. So we provide these services under an understanding. We have an outreach plan. If you want to visit we mentioned the SRSW and the city's website. We have a website as well. It's www.tosc.msu.edu/Gelman for this project, or you can just click on the map where the City of Ann Arbor is, and you can call up the website for this project. All the materials that are provided at this meeting are either already on our website or will be posted to the web. In this meeting tonight, we really have two goals, and that is to shed light on the extent of the problem, and in this case, we're really fortunate, I think, in that we can, I hope, shed light on solutions to the problem. Oftentimes when we come to a community for the first time, everybody knows there's a problem, but we're not at this stage. In this case, it's called the Feasibility Study. In other programs, it's called different things sometimes. But in this case, we have a feasibility study, which is simply a proposal by PLS to do certain things to address the dioxane contamination problem. So I'm hoping that we can shed light on the extent of the problem and the range of solutions that are under consideration, and, as I already described, to catalyze effective public involvement on this issue. So the contributions of TOSC, independent review of key questions. Reading that, key question, community questions. So key community questions, I think, is probably what it should say. Provide information on key concepts related to the PLS dioxin problem, and provide an independent review that will also be provided to Michigan DEQ on this issue. So it's not just something that is available here. And in fact, we would encourage you, if you agree with the document, to send it along with your comments to Michigan DEQ. And one of the things that's included in the materials on the table is the public comment form. It has an email address and a mailing address for DEQ that you can send in your comments. What brings us here tonight? What is the issue that's at hand now? As I've described, we've conducted this outside review of PLS and DEQ proposals. One of the really important things about this meeting, as we see it, is to provide another means for gathering community comments and questions. In fact, we're going to do something that's a little unusual for one of these meetings, and following this introduction, we're going to go into a process of gathering comments and questions. We've already got one of them listed. And to add to that, I probably would add the word disclosure, because that's what are the disclosure obligations of property owners is an issue that was raised at last week's meeting, and I know is an issue of concern. So we're going to go into that process for about 10 minutes, possibly longer if we need longer. There will be another opportunity for comments and questions, a full hour or more at the end of the meeting. This is important now, as you've already heard, because of the deadlines. The public comment period ends Monday. We wanted to hold this meeting earlier with everything else going on, people being away, and with DEQ's meeting last week. We're right up against the end of this comment period. So this is really a critical time for submitting comments. On September 1st, MDEQ will announce its decision on this issue. And then in September, and I think Matt can probably give you the date on that, there will be a court hearing. As many of you know, that's an issue that complicates this, in that Judge Shelton has, in a sense, tasked both MDEQ and PLS with coming up with a solution to this problem. That's a change from what we usually encounter. It's usually the responsible party that is charged with formulating. They negotiate on various issues with the agency, but in this case, the judge has obligated both parties to come up with a solution to this problem. So that September court hearing, I think, will be a critical step in the process. And September 8th is that date.
You can always call. You can always call, and it's Judge Shelton's court, and it's open to the public.
Where?
The Washtenaw County Courthouse.
On Main Street.
Yep.
Let me describe very briefly what TOSC has done. We have conducted a detailed review of PLS and MDEQ proposals. We are making specific recommendations, as you can see in the document that you've received. That is Dr. Larry Lemke's review of these proposals. We've come to the conclusion that there are omissions in both proposals, omissions in particular focusing on the DEQ proposals. There are some real deficiencies in the PLS proposal. There are some things that we would like to propose. We will propose in tonight's meeting to address these, what we see as omissions in MDEQ's remedial alternative. And as I've described, we will propose methods for strengthening the plans that MDEQ has submitted in their remedial alternative. Now, I don't know if all of you were at last week's meeting, but there was a fact sheet that MDEQ had that described the base. It weighed the various options that Pall has put forward and proposed a remedial alternative. If you need a copy of that document, you can go probably to the city's website, SRSW's website, TOSC's website, but the best place to find it is on DEQ's website. And I'm getting a word from Sybil Colin, who's the project manager for this site, for this issue, that there are copies of DEQ's fact sheet. It's a very detailed overview of the proposals that have been submitted by Pall, the range of options considered by Pall. We're not going to repeat what was heard in last week's meeting, but we are going to describe a little bit about the proposals that Pall has made. And I already mentioned it's unusual for MDEQ to provide its own remedial alternative. Judicial process is an important factor here. We've already heard in the introductions the goal is to arrive at a solution that is effective, protective, and community acceptable. And that's something that in many communities, the community's concerns are not factored into the decision-making process enough in an informed in an informed way, and that's what we're hoping we can do through the work that TOSC does, but also the work that the city and SRSW are doing. And I've already mentioned that now is the time for public input on this. And with that, what I'd like to do is, before we're going to have Larry Lemke, who's an environmental engineer at Wayne State University, talk about the review work that he's done. And he's first going to address what you might call the problem statement. What is the problem? Why is this dioxane contamination issue a problem? And then after that, provide solutions, what we see as solutions to that problem. But prior to that, what we'd like to do is to take a few minutes to gather comments and questions. Now, it's not necessary, if you want to come to the microphone, that's perfectly fine. It's not essential that you come to the microphone. I will repeat, if you don't come to the microphone, since CTN is videotaping this, and they're also somebody that we should, that TOSC wants to thank. But if you don't come to the microphone, I'll repeat the question, and Matt is going to be our scribe, and we'll jot down the questions that you have. So we don't anticipate this being the extended Q&A session, but if there are some pressing questions that you would like to make sure get answered, we're going to hopefully give answers to all of these questions in the main presentation. So we're not going to answer all these questions now. The process here is to gather questions.
And the reason we're doing this up front is because some of these meetings, people don't get a chance to ask their questions, and they leave. And sometimes people don't know what other people are there for, and sometimes they lose track of what the meeting is going to be about. So what we want to do today is make sure, if you got any questions at all that's relating to the current plan or the cleanup at all, we want to just brainstorm questions that you have.
Roger, one thing you might point out to folks is there's another thing pending and another comment period that's open right now, which has to do with MDEQ's proposed drinking water standard for 1,4-dioxane. And if people are not aware of it, okay, you got it?
We have a sheet about that. We only brought one of these, but there is a the public hearing will be held on Thursday, August 26th, 2004 at 1 p.m. in the Con. You can come up after the meeting and jot all this down. A and B, conference room, atrium level, Constitution Hall, 525 West Allegan, Lansing. Maybe I should repeat that. 1 o'clock on August 26th in the Con A and B conference room, which is on the atrium level of Constitution Hall, 525 West Allegan. And there are a number of substances, including 1,4-dioxane, that are under consideration for amendments under the Safe Drinking Water Act for their standards, drinking water standards. And 1,4-dioxane is one of those.
Is that the same building location where the stakeholder hearing is held?
Yes.
Just a further comment on that?
Glenn, so that question gets repeated. Glenn was asking if that is the same room where the stakeholder meeting, same building where the stakeholder meeting.
It is the same room.
Same room, in fact, of that building.
Can you give that address again?
Sure, 525 West Allegan, Lansing.
Can that be put on the web, somebody's website?
Certainly, we can put it on the TOSC website. We'll put it prominently on the front page for a short period of time. And this is also on MDEQ's, and you could also talk to Sybil Colin, and she could send you a copy of this notice of a public hearing.
Just a further comment on that. My understanding is that if that standard is adopted, it could change the targets that Pall has to meet in its cleanup. So that should be considered when you're thinking about what kinds of comments are important.
Sure.
Well, does it look like they're going to go ease up or become more stringent? Which way is it going?
We will, I think what we want to do is to jot the questions down now. We're going to make sure, in fact, Roger has proposed that we check off questions as they're answered, whether they're answered in the main presentation or they're answered during the question and answer session later. But at this point, we are getting down as many questions as possible. Yes?
All have deep pockets that allows for any possible solution, or is there going to go bankrupt and then the state's going to take over? You know, how much money is allowed to do this?
The question is, how deep are Paul's pockets and how much money would this cost to do? And is it something that would affect the company seriously financially, depending on what alternative is chosen? Is that fair summary? I'm just making sure, since I'm the one speaking into the microphone. Yes?
I'd like to suggest under community involvement that we get a petition campaign up in the next few days and get as many signatures opposing the DEQ proposal.
The comment is that a petition campaign be started to gather as many signatures as possible, stating opposition to the DEQ proposal. Yes?
My question is, if we don't clean up the main source of contamination, is it really possible to clean up the E aquifer?
The question is, if we don't clean up the main source of contamination, is it possible to clean up the E aquifer?
In other words, doesn't there need to be some integration?
Doesn't there need to be integration between activities at the area that's called the core, integration with that? And Dr. Lemke will explain more for those of you who may be new to this issue, the relationship between the western areas of contamination, the Pall property, and the Unit E contamination, that is the contamination that is at the leading edge under the city of Ann Arbor, in the groundwater under the city of Ann Arbor. Yes?
Can you explain to us the decision-making process so we know who has the final say?
Sure.
How is this, like the plans that are out there?
Sure.
Who is going to end up getting it?
Okay. Who makes the final decision? Who is going to have the final say on this issue? What is the decision-making process on this issue?
How are the dollar costs determined in relation to the proposed alternatives? And what factor does the dollar cost play in the eventual decision?
What factor does the cost of remediation play in the final decision? And how is cost taken into consideration?
How certain are we that the Doty, Warden, Glendale perimeter is the leading edge, or that the plume has extended east of that?
How certain are we that the Doty, Warden, Glendale area is not affected by, is the leading edge? And I know that Dr. Lemke is going to address both questions about the leading edge as it applies to the cleanup standard of 85 parts per billion, but also the questions about the findings of dioxane at lower levels, because the plume is moving in an eastward direction, findings of dioxane at lower levels east of what is technically, for cleanup levels, considered the leading edge.
My question, one or two questions, is I would like to know why the Pall is not required to put a large pipe near the largest concentration so that the highest concentration areas can be treated. I'm also under the impression that there are areas that are surface ground areas that are highly contaminated that may be recontaminating the groundwater. And has that been tested and dealt with? And I also have a question about groundwater involvement and how that may affect the city of Ann Arbor and city of Ann Arbor residents. I'm not aware that the city has tested any groundwater that might move into the surface water. If they've done tests to determine whether the dioxin hasn't been moved into surface water, I'd like to know if those tests were done. That's it. Yeah.
Yes. Does the pumping that is carried out for the cleanup, the extraction of the groundwater contaminated with dioxane, affect the concentrations, the migration of? Okay. Does the pumping pull the water, contaminated water, toward the city? will pumping in the city draw contaminated water in that direction. Why don't we do, say, 2 more questions there, and then we'll move on to Dr. Lemke's presentation. Yes?
What do I have my well tested for this? What do you call this thing?
1,4-dioxane is the name of the chemical, but it's not something that is, except by a specific request, is not normally going to be tested for in
Does the state include this if I send my water sample to it?
Does the state test for 1,4-dioxane if a water sample is sent there by a resident of this area? And that's a good question. It may be a question that depends on where you live and whether the state has flagged that as an area where a sample should be addressed for dioxane. There was one other question.
Matt, I believe you said that the water, the Ann Arbor City water is a blend, and that part of our water comes out of Huron River, and part of it comes from a well. Okay, where's that well, and is it?
I'll answer that question.
The question was, where is the Ann Arbor City well that has been, as you'll hear, taken out of use?
That's not what he said.
Temporary.
I'll answer it.
Thank you.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Ann Arbor source.
No, I'm right, but I'm making sure that the question is simply on the, unless he's also pointing it at the easel. I want to make sure that the question is heard by the taping, and where is the well located that the city of Ann Arbor uses as part of its drinking water source? And one more, I saw Glenn had his hand up.
What is the variation in the static pressure head in the Maple Village, Veterans Park area, and what is the historical variation in the static pressure head in the core area?
What is the static pressure head in the Maple Village, Vets Park area, and historically, what is the variation in the static water head? And all right.
What is the ability for homeowners to deny Pall access to their property for cleanup activities?
What is the ability of homeowners to deny access to Pall for cleanup activities that they may want to undertake? To deny or conversely allow, what is the process for allowing? But specifically your question is, right, can homeowners be forced to have wells on their property at Paul's behest? Yes. Rita?
Okay, this is a question I got asked by a lot of residents when I took around flyers. They want to know what the extraction wells are going to mean to their neighborhoods. How much disruption is going to result from the extraction wells? What are they going to look like? You know, how big are they? Are they going to be noisy? Are they going to be smelly? You know, pumping out diesel fumes? Are they going to run 24 hours a day, or are they going to be underground and hardly noticeable? And they want to know what the installation, monitoring, and upkeep is going to involve, and how long the stuff's going to take. They want to know about the wells themselves. What does it mean?
The residents that Rita LaCaruso passed out flyers to ask questions about the disruption that might occur in their neighborhood, whether there would be drilling rigs, whether there would be fumes from it, whether there would be noise, what sorts of activities, very specific sorts of activities would occur. And I know a question that was asked last week is, do we have any idea where these things would occur? That's a question that we certainly heard last week. And that was your question?
Any ideas where these will occur?
Right, and we certainly will discuss that. While I don't think providing a complete answer to that question, we will discuss that issue very specifically. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Larry Lemke. Larry is a senior lecturer at Wayne State University, got his PhD in environmental engineering here at the University of Michigan, and he has spent a considerable amount of time, long before he knew anything about the TOSC program, looking at this issue in a very detailed way. And what he has done now is to review the feasibility study that Pall Life Sciences has submitted and review the MDEQ remedial alternative, the fact sheet, and we're here to provide, as I described, that independent perspective.
Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. While Kirk brings up my PowerPoint presentation, I'll just let you know a little bit about my background. My degree, my PhD, is in environmental engineering, but most of my professional work and my prior schooling was in the field of geology, so I consider myself a geoscientist as well. Before coming back to school to do my PhD, I spent 12 years working for a major oil company in oil and gas exploration. So the kinds of things I did there were involving the evaluation of subsurface data sets, trying to make inferences about what's going on underneath the ground in between widely spaced control points, trying to solve some of the same types of problems we're looking at here in terms of 1,4-dioxane migration in groundwater through an aquifer system that are germane to the migration of hydrocarbons through reservoirs in deeper, higher pressure, higher temperature systems.
Your presentation got closed, and so is it on the desktop or?
It's right here.
Okay.
Technical glitches, par for the course. Thanks, Kirk. Now, one thing Kirk said was that I would try to answer all of your questions tonight. That is patently not true. I will not be able to answer all your questions. No one can answer all of the questions that are swimming around this issue. But what I will try to focus on are some comments having to do with the FS and the PLS plan as it's proposed, and an analysis of that, and an analysis of MDEQ's proposed preferred alternative, and then some recommendations in the area of monitoring, modeling, and mass removal. I will give a short introduction and overview, though. I recognize there are probably some of you who are new to this, and some of the questions that we heard last Wednesday night at the MDEQ meeting, to me, were asking for some basic information about how this system works. So I'll try and provide some of that as well. If you're a Pall, Gelman aficionado, please bear with me for 5 or 6 minutes while we go through the introductory material. Some of the questions I heard last Wednesday and then I'll try and address tonight are, do we need to take action? Why? Why should we be concerned? When do we need to take action? What threat does this plume actually pose? If we're talking about the E-plume, what would happen if we did nothing, if we left it alone? Could it get into anybody's drinking water? What will happen if that plume reaches the Huron River? Technically, what is the best solution? What is purely the technical side of the equation? Not dealing with the judicial, the economic, the political, the emotional issues that we all have about this as well. What is the science that supports this? And how can we be sure that the plans that are being proposed aren't going to fail? Now, what is the basis for pumping water out of the ground? It's been proposed both in the area of Wagner Road and at Maple Road. And specifically, what about pumping at the leading edge of the plume? Will it draw dioxane toward Ann Arbor at an increasing rate? Will there be a plan for monitoring to see if the concentrations are increasing? Why can't Pall or the DEQ or Larry Lemke tell us exactly where the wells and the pipelines are going to be? And what about the Evergreen Plume experience? Could the leading edge pumping actually exacerbate the problem rather than solve it? Well, let's start with the compound of concern, 1,4-dioxane. It's an organic molecule, has carbon, oxygen, hydrogen atoms. It's a solvent that was used in the manufacture of medical filters on site at the Gelman site. It is listed as a probable carcinogen with mild to moderate toxicity. It's bad for you if you drink it, eat it, if it gets on your skin, or if you inhale it. All of these things are not ways that we want to be exposed to dioxane. It's very soluble. You can put as much of it in water as you can pour into it. And that's important because when it gets in the groundwater system, where the groundwater moves, this contaminant moves with it. It's like a perfect tracer. In Michigan, we have a generic groundwater cleanup standard of 85 parts per billion. This is not a drinking water standard, it's a cleanup standard. And there will be the public hearing that you heard about a few minutes ago addressing this issue of actually trying to establish a groundwater drinking water standard. But right now we're working with 85 parts per billion. And we know that that standard is set to try and gauge what the excess cancer risk of about 1 in 100,000 people would be for someone about my size and age who drank water tainted with 1,4-dioxane over a period of several decades. 2 liters a day at 85 parts per billion equates to about a 1 in 100,000 cancer risk. How did it get into the groundwater? Well, Gelman Sciences used it for a period of about 2 decades. They used wastewater disposal practices that we would frown upon today, but back then, this was par for the course. They used unlined ponds and let their wastewater seep into the ground. They irrigated it, like with sprinklers on the grounds as well, and let it sink into the ground. It was discovered in Third Sister Lake, just west of their site, in 1984. And after that, they started testing groundwater in nearby wells and found it in 1985. Now, this is a map that I made in 1998. I became interested in this problem around 1998 because I was a graduate student and we started mining the data set that's available in the public repository of the Ann Arbor District Library. And I met with Roger Rail, who was also an excellent source of information on this site. And we picked it up and used it as a project for our groundwater hydrology class at University of Michigan. So we had students building groundwater models of this site, simplified groundwater models. This map shows concentrations of 1 part per billion outlined in yellow, 85 parts per billion outlined in orange, and 500 parts per billion and greater outlined in red. In the central area, which is called the core area here, the concentrations were upwards of 200,000 parts per billion in some spots, very, very high. The Pall site is this purple blob. That's their main site over there. And there are 3 landmarks, the first sister, the second sister, and the third sister lake that you can use to orient yourself. This is Wagner Road, running north-south. It's bounded on the south by Liberty, and on the north, this is Jackson Road. Now, the contamination spread from the core area in a number of plumes in a number of different directions at a number of different horizons. It's a very complex aquifer system. You can recognize that immediately. And this type of a map is an oversimplification because it's distilling lots of information from different horizons onto one plane. But you can see what we call the western plume migrating to the northwest, and the evergreen plume migrating to the northeast up in the Evergreen subdivision. And at this point in time, the E plume was not recognized. But if we were to map the E plume, which starts out in the deepest location here in the core area, but gets shallower as you move to the east, this is about the approximate outline of the E plume as we understand it today. What's been done out here? Well, in the core area, there are at least 10, maybe 12 extraction wells that are purging water. It's being treated with UV oxidation, ultraviolet oxidation, and hydrogen peroxide. And the treated water is released at a point right about here into a tributary of Honey Creek, which is here, and that flows up or downstream to the Huron River and discharges into the Huron River someplace upstream of the city's main water supply intake at Barton Pond. The concentrations that Pall treats to are on average below 10 parts per billion per day, and usually well below that as well. And to this point, to the best of my knowledge, we've never detected 1,4-dioxane at the Barton Pond intake for Ann Arbor's water supply. The Evergreen Plume, over here we have a set of 2 extraction wells near the leading edge of the Evergreen Plume, LB1 and 2, and Allison extraction well a little bit farther to the east. And Pall also installed a horizontal well with screens in about these locations. This is the one that Alan Wasserman told us about the award that Pall won for the engineering of this horizontal well. It solved a number of problems for them, how to transport water from the Evergreen Plume back to the plant here to be processed, going underneath I-94 and a host of other, technically difficult areas to go through. Now, this is what the E plume looks like today. First thing you should think about when you look at a map like this is, what is the basis for drawing it? Where is the control? How many wells are actually involved in giving us data to make a map like this? So I like to highlight the wells. There are a little more than 24 wells that have been used to actually sample and test the concentration of 1,4-dioxane. This is a large area. It's about 1 mile from Wagner Road to Maple Road, which runs right through here. And this area we'll talk about a lot. This is the Maple Village area with Kmart and the shopping center to the west and Vets Park to the east. And this is near what we call the leading edge of the plume. Now, I use that term advisedly because the leading edge as it's mapped here is based on the 85 parts per billion. It is not the true leading edge of the plume. The true leading edge of the plume, if you go to the detectable limit of 1 part per billion, is somewhere farther to the east. But for regulatory purposes and for most of our discussion tonight, we're going to use the 85 part per billion leading edge, quote unquote, as a point of reference. All right, why should we be concerned about the E plume? Well, It's 100 feet or more below the ground at the leading edge, and even deeper in the core area. It doesn't affect people, animals, or plant life near the surface when it's that deep. And the farther the plume moves, the more it'll spread out and become diluted. Pumping contaminated water to the surface raises issues and problems all its own. Pumping large volumes of water out of an aquifer system has a negative impact environmentally on that aquifer system. And the wells, the pipelines, and the treatment facilities that are going to be required are really undesirable in anybody's neighborhood. Well, the first reason I would say we should be concerned is because as the plume advances, the concentrations are going to increase behind it. 85 parts per billion may be the concentration in this zone right here today. But as the plume continues to advance, somewhere to the east, in whatever direction it's moving, the concentrations behind it will increase. Right now, out here at monitoring well 82, we have 15 parts per billion. Behind it, we have a non-detect well. These are data from April and May, by the way, the most recent I was able to get my hands on. Behind that, here's a few in the hundreds. Behind that, we go up into 1,000. Here's close to 2,000, and back here, close to 3,000 parts per billion at monitoring well 72. If the plume advances the way our conceptual model suggests it should, these concentrations are going to move forward as the leading edge progresses farther and farther to the east. So 85 parts per billion may not sound bad today, but what's behind it may be a whole lot higher. Second, and probably most important reason, is receptor risk. Somebody may end up drinking some of this 1,4-dioxane. This is a map that was put together by Washtenaw County. And what I've done here is I've outlined, again, the 85 part per billion E-plume, and they're showing their estimation of the 1 part per billion limit of 1,4-dioxane. So this is maybe a truer representation of the leading edge of the plume, although this isn't constrained by many wells out here either. This is conjectural. Sorry? I think that's the 1. Yes, that's the 1. Okay. Now, as the plume moves farther to the east, press the right button here, it's going to encounter, or possibly encounter, several wells. First, we have the city's municipal water supply well here in the Montgomery well field, which already has seen 2 to 4 parts per billion 1,4-dioxane. And there are several other wells that aren't used for drinking water, but are used for water sources on the central part of the University of Michigan campus. Farther to the east, there's a whole cluster of wells in an island of Ann Arbor Township that are used for water supply wells. This neighborhood in here requires well water, or uses well water at this point in time. That's a possibility. Now, Pall has done an analysis, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail in a minute, of where they think the plume is going to move. And they show it heading down gradient to the Huron River, somewhere in this area right here. Now, what's going to happen when that gets to the Huron River?
Some markers, Larry.
Where is this?
What area?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing right here is the brand new Broadway Bridge. Okay, this is Argo Pond, and so the canoe livery is on the east bank over here, and so this is somewhere between M14 and Argo Pond in here. That's approximately where it's projected to come. I don't want to put too much emphasis on that because I don't believe that this projection has much credibility. Okay, and I'll tell you why in a minute or two. But if the plume does go under the river, there are other water supply wells in Ann Arbor Township on the east bank. I think that's unlikely, but it's a possibility that cannot be ruled out based on the information we have today. Now, another big question is, could this stuff end up all the way up in Barton Pond, where the Ann Arbor water supply, we take approximately 80% of our water from the Barton Pond. And I think the answer to this is it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. I can't rule it out with certainty. The reason it's unlikely is because the head of the river, someone asked about hydraulic head, and we'll talk about that in a minute, is much higher up here, steps down and steps down again. Water likes to flow from high head to low head, and so the potential for water and groundwater as well to flow is increased the farther downstream we go. All right, everyone wants to know how fast is the plume moving and where is it going? Tracy Davis from the Ann Arbor News asked me the other day, how fast is the plume moving? So in order to figure this out, you have to know two things. you have to know what the head gradient is, or the hydraulic gradient. That's the potential that drives the flow. And you have to know what the hydraulic conductivity is, the preferred pathways. That's basically the distribution of sands and gravels and sediments that allow the water to flow through it. How do you measure a head gradient? If you have an aquifer system like this one, where we have sand sandwiched between two clays, a confined aquifer, you can drill wells into the aquifer. If you screen those wells, you allow openings so water can flow in, and see how high the water flows into the well, you have what's called a static water level. That's where the water sits. Draw a line and connect the dots, and you have a piezometric surface. It's a potential surface. That's the surface to which the water wants to rise. Now notice that surface is sloped. Slopes from left to right. So down gradient is from left to right. And so if groundwater wants to flow through the system, it's going to flow from left to right. This tells us information about which direction the groundwater wants to flow. The other thing we need to know is the permeability of the sands and the gravels. You can measure these in a column in a laboratory if you have a sample, or you can infer them from pump tests. And there's a number of data sets out there to help us estimate hydraulic conductivities. It's like the speed limit through which the water can pass through the sand or gravel. And then we use something called Darcy's law, and I promise not to show you any equations other than this one today. The velocity is equal to a relationship that has, let's see, I pressed the wrong button, but that's okay. Hydraulic conductivity, which is K, and the head gradient, delta H over delta L in it. Hydraulic conductivities in a reasonable range out here might go from a minimum of 25 feet per day to 250 feet per day. The gradient from about 0.001 feet per feet to 0.01 feet per feet. If you use a reasonable porosity estimate of, say, 20%, you can get a range of velocities between about 1/10 of a foot per day all the way up to 12.5 feet per day. That's a large range of uncertainty. Is the plume moving at 1/10 of a foot per day, or is it moving at 10 feet per day? Well, if we use the most likely values here, based on the information we have, what you end up is calculating a range for the velocity of the plume on the order of 1 to 2 feet per day. That's a best estimate. It could be a little faster in some places, a little slower in other places. But if you had to press me for a ballpark figure today, I'd tell you the plume is probably advancing at 1 or 2 feet for every day that we delay taking an action to stop it from moving forward. Okay, where's the plume going? Well, Pall relied on this map, which was put together by consultants for the city when they were looking to try and protect their municipal supply well. And they used the gradient between the edge of the plume and the river. Now notice this map is constrained by 2 wells. This area of the map is constrained by 2 wells and 2 elevation points along the river. That's not a whole lot of data. And what we have is a relatively continuous gradient between the leading edge of the plume and the downstream receptor, which would be the river. So this is the zone that Pall calculated. And basically what you could do is, if you had a marble or a golf ball and you set it on this surface, you'd be looking to see which way it would roll, and it would roll straight downhill. Now there are a lot of problems with this model because it's overly simplified. And here's just a few of the problematic assumptions. I listed more in the critique, but the model assumes that groundwater flow is horizontal. We know there are vertical head gradients here. We know contamination's been moving up and down from aquifers, so that's not a reasonable representation of this system. We have a 1-layer model. We know there's lots of different aquifers here as well, and we're assuming uniform contaminant concentrations vertically within that 1 layer. Yet we know that concentrations can vary based on our vertical profiling as much as 3 orders of magnitude in any one given well. We've assumed homogeneous and isotropic hydraulic conductivity, 1 value. This is probably the worst assumption of all, because there is all kinds of variability in the aquifer system. This is a complex aquifer system. You've heard that many, many times before. We have a uniform hydraulic gradient, and we used an excessive longitudinal dispersivity, which tends to dampen the predicted concentration when it actually reaches the receptor point. So if you look at what we know about the hydraulic gradient today, this is Pall's map at the leading edge of the plume. These contours are contours of the hydraulic head. Notice that it's not uniform. Right in here we have a very, very sharp break in slope where the hydraulic head becomes very steep. So that suggests to me there's a lot of complexity to be expected between this point and the river. All right, if we look at the distribution of well control points and the positions that we have known concentrations, there's still a lot of room in between those control points. I'm going to propose, this is highly unscientific, but just to help you conceptualize, I call it the Play-Doh model of plume movement. And this is my daughter working, maybe you have one of these if you have kids. You put Play-Doh in this machine, you push pressure on it, and it squeezes out these little patterns in the front. So if you start out with a pattern like this, which actually might be representative of the aquifer is not uniform across. There are places within the aquifer where groundwater will flow more easily than others. And you start the process of squeezing the Play-Doh through. And I put yellow Play-Doh into the machine here and started to squeeze it through. You notice it comes through in some places sooner than others. And I've chased it with some red Play-Doh, so you can just start to see the red Play-Doh coming through. And maybe that might represent a contaminant or higher concentrations. And as it starts to come out, you start to see a lot of variability. And the question I would pose is, what if the E-plume really looks more like this than one uniform mass? What if it is a bunch of little stringers of preferred pathways, and have we put our monitoring wells in the right places to actually sample these? It's probably not like Play-Doh, but it's probably a lot more complex than the simple notional models that you've seen depicted to date. Okay, so if it is more like this, the problem is that I would say there's room for additional pathways for contaminant to move that we haven't actually sampled, and we can't be sure that the leading edge of the plume really is right here where it's mapped. So, where's the plume going? The answer is, we don't know. We need more information to be able to predict where the plume is going to go. But even with that additional data, there's always going to be some uncertainty about the plume's migration pathway. We're never going to know for sure. More information is good. Exhaustive information is never going to be a part of this problem. So how do you deal with that? Well, one way to address the uncertainty is through the use of an appropriately complex groundwater model. And we'll talk about that in the next segment of my presentation. But right now, I've agreed to take a timeout for 5 or more minutes so that if I've stimulated any additional questions based on that, or if I haven't filled you in with some important piece of background information, we can capture that now and get it onto our question boards as well. So the ball is back in your court. Yes?
This is not apropos what you said so far, but I'm wondering if you will talk about other scientific consultants that have looked at the picture broadly, not within the frame of the DEQ proposed solution. And with that in mind, what is the ideal solution? If money and politics were not an issue, what is the scientific, is there a reasonable scientific consensus on that?
Is there a reasonable scientific consensus among other scientists or consultants or engineers who have looked at this problem, not sandwiched in the limits of the FS and the DEQ proposal that we're looking at tonight, but the bigger picture? And will I talk about that? Probably won't talk about that much tonight, but no, I'm going to refrain from answering right now and try and capture some more questions. Yes?
I would like to hear a historical, just a brief historical analysis of past predictions of geological and hydrological probabilities and how those things have actually turned out. For example, I know the E plume was never envisioned in this contamination, and I thought we were assured that this would never occur. And that's just one example of, I think, how difficult it may be to get a careful handle on where these geological formations are, given that we can't put an infinite number of wells to determine exactly where the soil is sandy, where it's clay, where it's got gravel. But past experience, it would seem to me, would be worth reviewing.
And just to clarify your question, you're referring to this site and the Gelman contamination. You're not talking about globally. You're talking about this site and its 20-year history. Thank you.
Given the complexity of the model needed and the lack of certainty, even with the predictions of a good complex model, doesn't that suggest that there should be another approach other than this one? If it's that complicated, if it involves residential neighborhoods, maybe this whole DEQ proposal is not a good idea.
Does the complexity of the system and the model that's required suggest that maybe a totally different approach should be taken?
I've heard repeatedly that this is very complex, so I assume that when you're dealing with it, you need a lot of judgment calls that you're making. And I wondered if anybody has gotten input from the U.S. EPA groundwater research people in Oklahoma. I understand that they have a PhD who specializes in 1,4-dioxin groundwater cleanups. I would be interested in knowing if anyone has talked to them and what kind of analysis they would recommend doing in this kind of situation.
Thank you. Yep, in the back.
I'm just kind of wondering, the stuff had to come from somewhere. Is enough remediation been done at the source to essentially keep dioxane from continuing to flow into the E-plume? I mean, you'd think it came from somewhere, and you'd think if you stop the source, you'd eventually dilute it somewhere.
The question is, has enough been done to actually remediate and cut off the initial source of contamination to keep it from continuing to move outward in aquifers such as the E-plume that we're talking about tonight? Does that capture your question?
Yes.
Good. Hand over here.
In a plume of this size and breadth, isn't it possible to design and locate extraction wells and pipelines so you never have to go into a neighborhood, but instead can be in more business-like settings or in main thoroughfares?
With a plume of this size and magnitude, would it be possible to design a containment and extraction system that doesn't have to be located in a neighborhood setting, but could be located instead in a municipal or a business or an industrial area, something other than a residential area? Yep.
How and why were the current sampling wells chosen, and who chose them, Pall or the MDEQ?
How and why were the current sampling wells chosen, the locations, the installation? Who chose them? Was it Pall, or was it the MDEQ, or was it some other process? Yep.
Yeah, I would like to know how someone would go about finding out if Pall is proposing a well on their property, whether or not that location is something that would be useful for to add to the science and eventually to a solution, or if it's just something that is being proposed in order to be doing something, because they're under pressure to do something.
I think the question is there a way for a private landowner to find out if Pall had proposed to drill a well on his or her property, whether that well was actually intended to be beneficial, if there was a consensus that that was an important control point or access point, or whether it was just simply something that had been proposed to help Pall appear to be moving forward in fighting the problem. A well of convenience rather than a well of necessity. Is there a way for a person to find out and to come to a judgment on that? Anybody else? Yep, once again.
You didn't make mention of deep well injection on the part of Gelman. I always thought that I've lived here for so many years. I know they did deep well injection.
The question is, I failed to mention deep well injection, and yes, deep well injection was used for disposal of contaminated water. Their well was more than a mile deep, and it was used for several years on site in the core area. They ran into problems with that well and stopped using it, but it's been proposed as another, I'm answering yes, as another potential solution. Let me get the one in the back and then back to the microphone. Yep, way back. I did mention that one means that was used was spray irrigation. I'm not suggesting that it should be used. It was used in the past, and that's one way that I believe 1,4-dioxane actually made it down into the ground and into our aquifer system.
So the question, my question then would be, how can we ensure that it went from this topical origin of soil and obviously went down to the aquifers and didn't somehow didn't transport itself in a potentially more hazardous way?
The question is, how can we be sure that water that was sprayed onto the soil in that way actually did just simply sink down into the aquifers but didn't spread or wasn't transported in other ways that might be of concern to us, surface flow or some other transport mechanism?
One other quick question. Due to the high level uncertainties
The question is, does the highly complex nature of the aquifer suggest that if we postponed action, we could be increasing the risk to public health and the environment? Thank you for that. Back to the microphone, and then I think we're going to move on after this question.
Is it true that when Pall was injecting in the deep well that the EPA, the feeling was EPA wouldn't renew their permit because they were violating it? And if that is true, is it likely that they could even get another permit from EPA to do a deep well injection?
Okay, so a permitting question and a historical question at the same time. And I won't answer that because I don't know the answer to that one tonight. Okay, thank you for those questions. You can ask more questions at the conclusion. We'll go as late as we need to answer them, but I'm going to press on. So, if we decide that we need to do something about the E-plume, what is the best option? We've heard a lot about pumping, and pumping is designed to achieve something called hydraulic capture. So I'm going to tell you what that is and how that works. I'm going to explain it so we have a basis for evaluating these proposals. Then I'm going to review the Pall Alternative 6 that has been proposed in the FS. I'm going to critique the MDEQ's alternative, and I'll give you our recommendations. Hydraulic capture. All right, remember this diagram? This is the hydraulic head. We know the piezometric surface is sloping from left to right, so groundwater flow is going to move in that direction. Now suppose we use that center well as a pumping well, and we started to remove water from the system. So we're going to pump water out of the system at that point at sufficient volumes to influence the flow. Well, we're going to start to change the piezometric surface. We're going to have something called drawdown going on in this well, and we're creating what's called a cone of depression, because in 3 dimensions the shape of this depression is conical. Now as a result, we have a sloping surface that's sloping even more steeply to the right, and it's sloping backwards from right to left. And as a result, now the groundwater flow direction is changed. We still have groundwater flowing with the regional flow direction toward this well, and maybe even accelerating a little bit as it gets toward the well. But we have a region back here that's flowing in reverse. Eventually, if we go far enough out in front of this well, though, we'll go back to regional flow from left to right. This is what's called hydraulic capture. We've stopped the flow of water at this point from left to right. Now, in map view, this could be the contours of hydraulic head, and I've just labeled them 880 feet above sea level to 800 feet above sea level. You can see they're higher to the left, they're lower to the right, so we'd expect groundwater to be flowing from left to right in this example. What if we were to put in that pumping well? Now let's place it somewhere right here. Well, the first thing we would expect to happen is we'd have a change in these contours. And this is the cone of depression that I was talking about that's developing around that well. And now, instead of the flow paths, those blue arrows that you see in the upper diagram, simply going from left to right, they're going to be changed, they're going to be warped. And some of them are actually going to flow into the well, they're going to be captured. And what we create is what we call a capture zone. So any contaminant that's moving toward the well in this zone is going to be sucked into the well, pulled in, and it's not going to be able to move past. How would this look if we had a hypothetical plume migrating its way toward the well? Well, I put this little illustration together. You can see it continues to migrate. It gets pulled in toward the well, okay? And then the highest concentrations advance, and they get pulled into the well as well. So with hydraulic capture, what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the natural flow direction of the contaminant migration, the groundwater flow direction. It does draw contaminant toward the well faster than it would have arrived under the natural gradient flow. People have been asking about that. Will leading edge extraction draw contaminant to us quicker? Yes, it will. It minimizes the volume of water that needs to be pumped and treated. That's good from an environmental standpoint because we don't want to take any more water out of the aquifer than we have to. And it's good from an economic standpoint because it costs money to treat this water, and we have to find some way to dispose of it, which has environmental implications as well. Notice, though, that it does not recover any contaminant that might have gone past the well before pumping starts. You can't suck contaminant back towards you with this approach. Maybe in a little bit, just up dip. You have a small capture zone up dip, but that, in practical purposes, is never going to extend more than a couple hundred meters at best. And then finally, this will prevent the downstream migration of contamination, provided that the well continues to pump. Turn the well off, the hydraulic containment field goes away, the natural gradient resumes, and contaminant can continue on its way. That's an important point. Okay, what happens if the plume is wider than the capture zone? Well, in this case, a portion of the plume, the central portion of the plume, is going to be captured by the well. But the edges of the plume are going to bypass the capture zone, and they're going to continue downstream. The capture zone width can be widened by either pumping more water out or by installing more than one well. Here's a theoretical capture zone. You can see this is for 2 wells, flow from left to right. If you pump at 400 gallons per minute, you have a narrow capture zone. If you pump at 1,600 or 2,000 gallons per minute, you have a much wider capture zone. These types of things can be optimized if you have the tools to do them. Okay, what about the Evergreen experience? Here's the Evergreen Plume Map that I made based on data that was available from 1986 and 1987. At this point in time, you could recognize, whoa, see if I can go back, a plume. I have the backspace button right here. I want to flip back and forth between these 2 maps anyway. You can recognize a plume, but notice there's no data out here to constrain the leading edge. I don't know where the leading edge was back in 1986, 87. I don't think in anybody's wildest dreams they would have imagined the plume could have traveled that far that quick. But if we go forward now to 1998, this is a decade forward in the future, now we've got a whole bunch of wells over here and we're constraining the leading edge out here somewhere near Allison extraction well. Let me just go back and forth. Back, forward, back, forward. So you can see the plume has moved, it's migrated. Has the plume moved on its own, or has it migrated because they're pumping now, at this point in time, near the leading edge? It's a combination of both, probably. So the initial scheme for containing this plume was pumping through a pair of wells, the red wells that I've got up here, LB1 and LB2 at a shallower and a deeper level, and actually treating and injecting the water back through injection well 1 and injection well 2, the green wells that are hard to see here. They were injecting that treated water back into the aquifer. Now remember I told you if you turn off your pumps, yes? That is correct. They were putting it into what was then considered to be the E aquifer. I glossed over that issue, didn't mean to, but the point that I want to put here is what happens if you're no longer able to inject? What happens if your injections wells foul, or you have pipeline problems or pump problems or anything like that? Well, then you can no longer pump, and if you turn the pumps off, the extraction pumps, then the plume can continue to move past you. And this is what happened. There were problems with these injection wells. So the water disposal issue bit us back then, and as a result, the plume advanced. Today, what's happening in this plume is we have a pair of extraction wells. LB1 and LB2 are still used, but even farther out in front, we have the Allison extraction wells. Those are capturing the plume, hopefully. And we also have the horizontal well with 4 screens that is trying to draw in high concentration contaminant from the spine of the plume. So did concentrations increase as pumping took place at the leading edge? Yes. And it was designed to do that. So if someone says Evergreen system failed because concentrations went up either in the extraction wells or in the monitoring wells nearby, that's not really true, because that's what was designed to happen with the system. If someone tells you the system failed because they weren't able to dispose of the water and they had to turn off the pumps and contamination sneaked by, that may be true. Now here's one of those simple groundwater flow models that I told you about that we made at the University of Michigan, and this was to evaluate those 2 pumping wells to see what kind of a capture zone each one of those created and to see if it was wide enough to actually capture the Evergreen plume as mapped. And the conclusion from this study was that it was probably adequate amount of pumping. But that conclusion is based on the simplifying assumptions that went into that model. This is not a complex model. I see questions going up. Am I supposed to stop and I'll take 1 or 2 and then we'll go on. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, I'm having trouble visualizing this because I don't know where you are in the level of ground. How deep are you?
The question is, it's difficult to visualize this because I don't know where we are in the level of ground. There are a number of aquifers that have been identified. From shallowest to deepest, we're going to call them the C, the D, and the E. If you go into more detail, it's the C2, the D0, or the D3, the E. But basically, shallower to deeper, they have higher letters, right? And for the Evergreen system, we're talking about what's called the D2 sand. And up until this point, we're close enough to the core area that everyone thought this was a continuous level of sand, a continuous layer. and it's been treated that way, it's been modeled that way, it's been remediated that way. Whether that's true or not, nobody knows what's in between the control points, but it appears to be a relatively robust model for this particular part of the contamination plume. So we're at mid-level horizons. Now when we talk about the E plume farther out in front, we're actually at about the same elevation. And so some of us are wondering, and one of my recommendations that you'll see at the end of the talk is we need to better define the relationship between the evergreen plume and the E plume with more control points in between. Okay, Roger, did you want to make a comment?
Well, I think just to clarify, the LB1 was put in quite a while before LB2 and was popping on its own. So it may have pulled some contamination past it because of it might not have been laterally too extensive, but the depth that was covered by LB1 was not sufficient.
Roger's comment is that sometimes when we put extraction wells in, we have to make a choice as to how much of the aquifer to screen, how much of the aquifer to let water flow into the well. And a fully screened extraction well screens from top to bottom. Typically that's not done because it decreases the efficiency of the well. It's preferable to have 2 or 3 wells screened at shorter intervals so you have more control and flexibility. And Roger's point was that LB1 was initially completed over a partial portion of the aquifer. It was partially screened in hydrogeologic parlance. And LB2 was later added to pump from lower levels. Now, is that another possible, higher level? Thank you, higher level. Is that another possible way that contaminant could have squeezed by us? Yeah, if we're not considering the third dimension, that can bite you as well. Okay, let me press on because I really don't want to talk about evergreen. I want to talk about the E plume tonight. Lessons, though, I'd say, number 1, if the higher concentrations are present up gradient, the leading edge extraction technique will draw them toward a purge well. No question about that. But this is an expected consequence, and it's not an indication that the system has failed. The contamination is on its way anyway. You're just making it come a little bit faster. 2, there are 2 requirements to maintain the integrity of this kind of a system. 1, you have to maintain the pumping. Can't turn it off for any extended period of time. And 2, you need to have monitoring wells at appropriate positions down gradient to find out if the system is actually working or not. We currently have 1 monitoring well that I'm aware of, monitoring well 47, down gradient of the evergreen plume. Perhaps that is not enough. Okay, now, what are we going to do about the E plume? Pall's proposal. We call it Alternative 6, okay? Number 1, they propose an interim response on the PLS property. They're going to use 3 wells that are already in existence, and they're shown here. This one is TW12. It's along Wagner Road. They propose to pump from a well in the vicinity of Maple Village, the blue well up here, to treat the groundwater using a treatment system located at or behind Maple Village Shopping Center, and to re-inject on the fringes of the plume somewhere between 1 and 85 parts per billion. That's the Maple Road interim response. And then in addition, we're going to have to install some monitoring wells between the leading edge of the plume and the Huron River to find out where the plume is going, to help us find out what the hydrogeology is, and to monitor the plume as it advances. And eventually, if it's necessary, when the plume reaches the Huron River, they would propose to pump the contaminated groundwater out of the river there and treat it and then release it back into the river, hopefully in a more convenient location. Now, that proposal has some advantages to it. Number 1, the interim response measures that they proposed could be implemented almost immediately, relatively short term, a couple months away from actually getting in there and doing something about it. And that's a good thing, in my opinion. Number 2, chasing the plume all the way to the Huron River could result in less disruption to neighborhoods, and that may be a good thing to some of you. No extraction wells in the neighborhoods, no pipelines in the neighborhoods, and the caveat here is that monitoring wells still would be required. Mike Gebhardt is here and can tell you a little bit more about well installation, but a typical monitoring well probably might take 4 to 7 days to install. Problems with Pall's proposal, as I see it. 1, the interim response at Wagner Road, will dioxane continue to move eastward off their property and continue to feed the plume? That's not clear to me from the information provided in the FS. Problems with the interim response at Maple Road, here. Well, how much water actually needs to be pumped and treated? there's a flux estimate. It's Appendix B in the FS if you care to read it. But in my opinion, it does not constitute an appropriate basis for estimating those volumes. Again, it's based on very simplified assumptions, and it doesn't take into account the complexity of the aquifer. If we don't know how much water we need to pump to actually stop or capture the plume, well, we could argue that we are doing some good just by taking some water out and removing some mass, but how much good are we doing? And the big question is, if you start re-injecting back into the same aquifer, what is the effect of that going to be? Without a reasonable aquifer model, you can't understand it, you can't anticipate it. It could be helpful, it could drive the contamination into the extraction well, or it could be harmful. It could spread the plume and make it even bigger. Don't know, can't answer that. So I think that's a big problem. What about the proposal to let the plume migrate to the Huron River? Well, if that takes place, then the 85 part per billion plume area is definitely going to move forward and it's going to expand. But we can't predict the plume's path with confidence. Don't know where it's going to go. And the plume may actually be harder to find and harder to capture as it moves farther to the east. We have indications that the geology of the aquifer system gets even more complex as you move farther to the east. If we wait for the plume to arrive at the river, we're going to delay cleanup actions, and we're going to have a longer cleanup because you're going to have to clean up the plume as it advances behind it. And we're going to potentially put downstream receptors at risk. So for all of these reasons, and for all of the uncertainties involved, the conclusion from TOSC is that we cannot concur with Alternative 6. It just doesn't make sense, and it's not something I would recommend to you as a professional in the environmental field. Let's take a look at the DEQ's preferred alternative then. Now the DEQ also has interim response measures at Wagner Road, but in contrast they would say, let's take advantage of the natural groundwater flow from west to east and put those wells along Wagner Road and hopefully set up a hydraulic containment field to keep contaminant from moving farther to the east. Let's stop it from moving off-site. At Maple Road, they have suggested that we have a treatment facility there, okay, and a pipeline for discharge of treated water, no injection, but a pipeline that would go to the Huron River and would be discharging at a point downstream of Barton Pond, downstream of the city's water supply. Okay, this is a big step in solving the water disposal problem that impedes efforts to speed up the cleanup here. And they would have a number of wells there as well, and I've hit the button. You can see now the leading edge capture proposal, and this is perhaps the more controversial part of the DEQ's plan. And here, they would have leading edge capture wells. They can't tell you how many exactly or exactly where they would be, but they would be hooked together via a pipeline system, and that pipeline would flow back to the treatment center here at Maple Village, and the water would eventually be discharged in the same discharge pipeline. Okay, the advantages of DEQ's proposal. Well, in their proposal, the plume is segmented into 3 parts, and each part then is cleaned up on its own. So you are accelerating the cleanup, and you're taking advantage of the natural groundwater flow direction. And by accelerating the cleanup and by cutting it off in 3 spots, you're actually reducing risk to potential downgradient receptors. The leading edge of the plume, hopefully, would be captured, preventing further expansion of the plume. And then this discharge pipeline, I think you would agree, has lots of advantages if it can actually be built in a way to discharge downstream of any water intake. Disadvantages of the DEQ's proposal, well, these interim response measures will take longer to implement than the ones that Pall has proposed, particularly the ones at Maple Road. Pipelines take time, both to permit and to build, and the wells in the pipelines for the leading edge are likely to be placed in neighborhoods. Yeah, I saw a hand go up in the back. Yep.
The term capture well, we've used extraction well and injection well. I get to understand what the capture well is.
Thank you for stopping. The question is, what is a capture well? I use the terms capture well, extraction well, and purge well pretty much synonymously. That means a well where we're pumping contaminated groundwater out of the ground. For a capture well specifically, each of these wells is designed to capture the segment of the plume that's up gradient, the segment of the plume behind it that is moving toward it, and to not let it get past and move to any farther position downstream. That's what I mean by a capture well. Capturing the plume is a hydraulic process, okay? Thank you for that question. All right, Now, there's a big problem with the Deq Use proposal too, as I see it, and that's that it does not specify the need for down gradient monitoring wells. If I'm going to install this system, I want to know if it's going to work, and the only way I can know that is to have another set of wells behind these taking samples at a regular interval to find out if contaminant is squeezing by and escaping. So if we have 3 capture wells or purge wells or extraction wells here at the leading edge, we might set up a containment zone or a capture zone that looks something like this. And we might also have another bank back here along Maple Road to cut off the highest concentration portion of the plume and keep it from moving forward. If this were the case, actually, the extraction system here might actually end up being decommissioned sooner than the one back here, because this is catching a much longer plume at this point. But the critical question in my mind is, how do you know that that's enough wells? How do you know it's working? I think you solve that by installing a series of monitoring wells with a logical spacing at some point out in front. And that seems to me a very logical and must be required in other places as well, and it should be specified up front so we know what to expect and we can steward against it. Okay, so there are a few problems with both the Pall proposals and the DEQ proposals. Number one, comes right back to what we don't know. We can't predict the plume's path with any certainty. We need more data and more information to do that. 2, the locations of the extraction wells, the number of extraction wells, and the pumping volumes that we need to actually process are not specified. The effectiveness, therefore, of any of these proposed remediation programs is in question. We can't evaluate it with any confidence. It might be the right thing to do, but how many wells do we need, and how much water do we need to pump, how big a pipeline do we need, and how big a treatment facility do we need? Can't answer that with a whole lot of confidence right now. And then finally, the down gradient monitoring needs to be specified as well. So how do we overcome these deficiencies? Here's some hopefully positive suggestions. I call it the 3 M's, and these come in 3 areas. The first M is monitoring, collection of additional data in strategic locations, adequate monitoring of down gradient of the purge wells, modeling. I'm going to tell you about what I consider to be a more effective modeling technique. I call it stochastic modeling. And mass removal. I think the interim response measures make sense. They're a good idea. We need to implement them. And eventually capture the plume at the leading edge. But not yet, because we're not ready. We don't have enough information to do that today. Okay, first, additional data collection, the monitoring part. I think we need monitoring wells, particularly east of the present-day E-plume mapped position. We need more wells between Evergreen and the E-plume, at Wagner Road, Maple Road corridor, and the Huron River bank. I'll show you a map next slide to show you where I think monitoring wells should go. The city's municipal supply well and its twin should be gamma ray logged so that it can be tied into the data set. The in situ chemical oxidation pilot test wells that we talked about so much during the last TOSC meeting should also be logged. Those are really important because they're very closely spaced and give us an idea of how widely monitoring wells and purge wells need to be spaced to actually capture the plume. Matt?
Can you just tell people what gamma ray logging is?
What is gamma ray logging? Gamma ray logging is a technique where you lower a tool, someone like a Geiger counter, down into the hole. You pull it up on a wire line at a very constant rate. It measures the natural gamma radiation of the sediments. What happens is that sediments that are rich in clays, contain a lot of uranium, thorium, potassium, are naturally radioactive. So you get high gamma ray counts compared to sediments that have been washed free of their clays, like sands and gravels. You have low gamma ray counts. So the gamma rays do 2 things for you. One, they give you an indication of whether it's aquifer material or aquitard material, clay-rich, clay-free, but they also give you an unbiased, repeatable record of what's down in the well that can be used to compare what you see in one well bore with another without the bias of an interpreter catching a sample every 10 feet or trying to describe cuttings that are mixing on their way up out of a well bore. And then finally, the USGS was involved in this project and sat on the MDEQ's Technical Review Committee and suggested on a number of occasions the use of rotosonic drilling. This means you drill from surface to the bedrock, you get a continuous core. There's some issues with rotosonic drilling as well. It's more expensive, but it's less time consuming than a typical well. But my point would be, do this in a few strategic locations so that you can actually correlate the sediments in the well with the gamma ray response, and then take advantage of all the other 90 monitoring well gamma rays that we have spread out through this system to help us build our model. Where would I put additional monitoring wells? Well, first of all, downstream of the leading edge. And I put 10 out here because that's the number that Paul had originally proposed in the FS. Now notice that some of them are sort of strategically linked up to form sort of a corridor. You want to form a fence so you know what's getting past you. Are these close enough? I'm not sure. They're a start. If there's significant variability in the responses that we see in those wells, we could put more wells in if we had to. And there's a few wells here to try and test whether contaminant is moving through the loosely spaced network of monitoring wells that exists today. I have put a well out here in front too because we actually have very, very little information about the system between us and the Huron River. That could be a problem if you're trying to model it, but it might not be that big a problem if you're determined not to let the plume get there in the first place. Now, a couple more wells. I proposed these last time at the last TOSC meeting in between the Evergreen Plume and the E-plume. I'm not convinced that those two aren't talking to one another. There is some pumping well data that we have. There was a well test, Montgomery well test, the city's Northwest Supply well test that actually seemed to have a response in one of the wells over here in the Evergreen Plume. So there may be some hydraulic communication, and some of this contamination at the same elevation as the Evergreen Plume may actually be getting through. I can't tell you whether that's true or not. The DEQ can't tell you that. I think we need a couple more strategically placed wells to investigate that possibility. Now, this is a long corridor of contamination that we're expecting the Maple Village wells to actually clean up and capture for us. I think it would be prudent to have a couple more wells in this corridor as well to make sure that we understand the migration pathway from where we're going to cut it off at Wagner Road until it gets to Maple Village. And then finally, this is also very important, we need a couple wells out near the Huron River. And the reason we need those wells is to establish whether the Huron River is actually in hydraulic continuity with the aquifers below, and to help us answer the question of what will happen if the plume actually does reach the river. Will it keep going? Will it discharge into the river? Or will it move downstream? Okay, how about computer models? Point number 2, modeling. Computer models do help us answer some of the questions. Groundwater flow models predict where the water will flow. Contaminant transport models predict how the contaminant will move with the water and spread out. And most importantly, these flow models can be used to evaluate alternative scenarios. We can try using 2 wells, 3 wells, 4 wells to contain the leading edge of the plume. How much water do we need to pump? If we have a number of models built, we can try multiple scenarios and try and get an idea of how robust or reliable the proposed remediation options are. The computer modeling, I suggest we need flow and transport simulation. We need a comprehensive model of the aquifer system. No more 1-layer models. No more 2 or 3-layer models. This system is not a layer cake system. This system is very complex and interrelated, and we need to start recognizing that and building into the models. And this is an important point too. It's not just semantics. We're trying to model the E-plume, not the E-aquifer. I think Pall was very forthright in labeling the FS an analysis of the E-plume. We're not interested in any one given aquifer. We're interested in the contamination. That's what needs to come out, and it's moving through multiple aquifers. It's moving through the system, so it's the plume that is of concern. In order to model the plume's movement, we have to model the entire aquifer. We need an integrated approach. The stochastic approach should be adopted, not a deterministic layer cake stratigraphy. It's not appropriate for the system out here. We will have to use something called geostatistics, which is an analysis of the spatial variability, both vertically and horizontally, of the aquifer characteristics. And we're going to need more than one model, multiple realizations. Geostatistics helps us do that. It can honor all of the known control points while having a random component in between the control points. You do a number of models, 10 models, 25 models, 50 models, and you test them all against your proposed remediation plan, and you find out which ones fail, or if they all fail, or if none of them fail. And then you start to build a confidence level for what you're doing and whether it makes sense. Finally, the model has to be available to the public for evaluation. We haven't seen Pall's comprehensive model. The DEQ has a copy of it. It's For some reason, there's a confidentiality agreement. I don't understand why. But I do know that any community or any scientist or any engineer who's asked to evaluate decisions that are based on a model needs to have access to the model. We all need to be able to see it, understand all the assumptions that went into it, and to play with it. Those of us who can drive the model need to do sensitivity analysis and find out whether we can rely on it or not. Okay, and then mass removal. Yes, interim responses make sense to me. I would recommend them. At Wagner Road, I believe we should optimize the well locations and the pumping volumes using the groundwater model that we're going to build. And I think we should evaluate the influence of pumping from what is actually the E aquifer there on the shallower aquifers. If we don't know what pumping an extra 200 or 300 gallons per minute from the E aquifer is going to do, is it going to draw more contamination downward? Or is it going to affect the hydraulic containment field that's keeping contamination from moving out of the core area into the E plume or into the western plume? We need to know that, and we need an integrated model to be able to evaluate that. At Maple Road, we need to install the treatment system. That's a good place for it. It has a lot of benefits. It makes sense from a community standpoint. It needs to be modular so that if we need to add on and build excess capacity later, we need to be able to do that. But we can get started with that soon. We need to get started right away permitting and installing the discharge pipeline that the DEQ has envisioned. And while we're doing that, we need to be optimizing well locations and pumping volumes again using the model. And if possible, maybe pump and start discharging if the sewer system is available and has excess capacity. All right, I'm going to go way out on a limb now and show you what I think a potential timeline, a way forward or a path forward could be for this plan. Here's a decision. In September, the court approves a modified version of the DEQ plan and says to the DEQ and says to Pall, implement it. So they start moving forward. Well, the monitoring well drilling out in front of the plume and in other key locations can get going right away. And we want that to happen right away so we can use that data and integrate it. Maple Village Treatment Facility needs to be approved by the MDEQ and needs to be built. I don't know exactly how much time it should take, but I would think if we got started right away, maybe on the order of a year, it could be ready. Now, how about that stochastic model that I was talking about? I think if we did that, and it should be done by professionals, a nationally recognized environmental consulting firm who have experience building these models, I think if they had a team of interpreters working on it, it's still probably going to take 6 to 8 months to complete. And once it's completed and it integrates the new data that are available, there's a period of time when you're using that model to actually make decisions and optimize plans for the wells. And it's during that decision-making period and optimization that the community needs to be involved to understand how the model is being used and to make sure that other constraints, other than just the technical ones, are taken into account for siting these facilities. The discharge pipeline, it's going to take some time to permit it, both from a building standpoint and from a discharge standpoint, and it's going to take time to construct it. So if all these things come together, maybe the Wagner Road interim response measures could happen within a year, maybe sooner. Pall could move sooner in that area. Maple Village interim response could be implemented in about a year from this time as well. Now, what about the leading edge well and pipeline installation? Well, I would suggest that we need to delay any action in that area until, number one, the additional data that we need are collected, analyzed, and number two, the model is built so that the DEQ, Pall, and us, so that we can all evaluate the number of wells that are needed, the position of those wells, and optimize them to provide, number one, the greatest effectiveness for capturing the plume, and number two, the least disruption to our neighborhoods and our streets. Okay, so let me conclude then. Leading edge extraction then occurs maybe 15 to 18 months from now. Let me conclude. Number one, conclusion, TOSC does not support alternative 6 as proposed in the FS. TOSC does support the MDEQ's proposal with some qualifications. One, additional data monitoring wells are required and need to be specified. Number two, a comprehensive stochastic groundwater model that takes into account the complexity of the aquifer needs to be built and used. 3, installation of the treatment facilities at Maple Village and the discharge pipeline construction should go ahead as soon as possible, concurrent with the modeling and concurrent with the monitoring well drilling, concurrent, not one at a time in sequence. These activities need to occur all together. And then the purge well locations and pumping rates should be optimized using the groundwater model. Finally, they should then be delayed until the additional data collecting, the modeling, and the optimization are done. And with that, I will conclude my presentation and we can move on to more question answering.
Well, one thing we could do right off is to address the specific questions that have been asked that are not yet checked off. And of course, some of those questions, as Larry alluded to earlier, are at this point not answerable. For example, locations of wells at the leading edge. In fact, that is something that Larry has proposed to be delayed for some time while the model is completed. We could do that. Go through those questions. I think that would probably be a productive activity. We also, of course, will take additional questions. One question that I wanted to address specifically related to the availability of, and I believe the gentleman over here asked the question of an independent consultant or an independent expert examine various aspects of this. Some of you were at our March meeting, and we had Dr. Susan Maston, and Dr. Maston had a family crisis of sorts and wasn't able to make it to tonight's meeting. She told me that she sent her regrets that she's not able to come to the meeting, but she did assist with the preparation of the report that Larry is the primary author on. And Larry is certainly an independent expert in some of these areas who has analyzed some of the proposals that have been put forth. And TOSC has the ability to bring in other experts. If, for example, somebody to evaluate the model, we have a really first-rate groundwater modeler at Michigan State. We don't have to turn to Michigan State, though. The TOSC program has the ability to bring in faculty really from any university. So we could have somebody evaluate the model once it's completed and provide an outside independent feedback to you on that model. It really depends on, at this stage, I think it really depends on what additional needs there are. I can see from, that maybe I'm not getting at your question, or perhaps I am.
I think that there are already reports by technical experts on the big picture that we could draw on. It's not a matter of getting additional people at this point. Don't we have some historical record? Aren't there already technical reports?
Well, we heard earlier about the dioxane expert at US EPA, and it's entirely possible that that the individual with US EPA with particular expertise in the remediation of groundwater contaminated with 1,4-dioxane could review this.
Excuse me, Roger, have there been existing reports that you folks have summarized or?
To deal with the E-unit?
There was a review of the whole site in 1994 by Camp Dresser McKee.
Okay, why don't you come up to the microphone?
The E-aquifer has obviously been contaminated forever. They just didn't do a consistent job of doing testing at all levels, and they actually had a well at that level that they lapsed in testing for many years, and they just tested it recently, and it's 43,000 parts per billion. In 1994, Camp Dresser McKee did, at the request of the DEQ, a consultancy, to review all of the underlying data that was being used to develop a remedial plan. That was before any major contaminant removal or remediation was happening at the core area on the plant site. The Evergreens remediation had been underway for about a year, started in 1993. That was the only pumping that was being done at that time. Camp Dresser McKee said in their closure section, I think I even brought a copy of it, that there were significant problems with the modeling and the analysis that the company under DEQ review had done at that time. The aggregation of the data, the analysis of the data, the assumptions that were used to put the model into operation with the data all led to results that didn't comport with what was actually happening in the environment. In other words, if you used their model, put their data in the way that they had arranged it, used their assumptions, Camp Dresser McKee found that the dioxane would have been in different places than it was. And they said before any, because these are dynamic systems, and I think Larry's presentation elucidated that, they said that these things needed to be resolved before they began remedial operations. And the implication was they could really make a mess of this. The DEQ said, oh, well, there were just some misunderstandings and some things hadn't been put in the reports. And anyway, they should just go ahead and the performance monitoring system would pick up problems and then they could fix it up later. Well, of course, the performance monitoring system was also designed based on the use of the same data and models, and it wasn't any better than that was. So Camp Dresser McKee did do a complete analysis. This last year, and fairly recently, the DEQ hired Weston to review the FS and the remedial action plan. To my understanding from reading the Weston report, they didn't look at any of the underlying science or lack of it. All they looked at was what was in the report and whatever Pall produced in the SS and these appendices. And as far as I know, the DEQ didn't develop any of its own science for its alternative. I think they used the same science that's out there. So the problem for us is the inadequacies that were never corrected after the Camp Dresser McKee review, the inadequacies that are here now, and I might say the problem I have with the analysis that TOSC has done is that, number one, it doesn't recognize the way these remediations are put together, the way the law is written. The polluter designs, configures the, develops the science, the data, configures the remedy. The DEQ looks it over. This is the first time the DEQ has advanced anything like its own proposal, and I think it's a terrible proposal. It's based on the same junk science that the polluter uses. So the usual way this is done does not allow for the kind of independent and much more thorough work that's being proposed. I'd thought of possibly having a work group put together that would be made up of citizens who shouldn't, by the way, come in at the late stage that Larry's talking about. Citizens need to be in on this from the beginning because we are terribly impacted. The farther this goes, the more the burden shifts, the burden of cost, risk, and if not liability, damage shifts to the community. And so if there could be a new paradigm put forward by the DEQ where there would be a work group of the local governments, the citizens, Pall if they want to be involved, and an independent consultant that's first rate, that would be great. But I think we have to deal with the exigencies of the reality we're facing here. When Larry talks about more down gradient wells, where are those? In our neighborhood. I live 4 very short blocks from the proposed purge well at Doty and Arbor View. And here are some of my neighbors here that I talked with about this today. These obviously are speculative locations. How do they determine a more exact location? By extensive hydrogeological investigation. What does that mean? Lots more wells being drilled in our neighborhoods without the prospect of really reaching anything that's definitively effective. That means it will capture the additional concentrations that are drawn into the neighborhood, will be effectively captured, but protectiveness is just as important. The fact is, folks, the law reads that when, and the company now under the new Michigan rules has to send out letters to people whose property is involved in contamination at or above 85 parts per billion that's in the environs. That means that, number one, you become part of the Pall facility under law. That is their contamination site. That people were asking about access to property. That means that the company can seek, with the DEQ's support, court orders for access to private property for response activities. It means that at point of sale, you must disclose, you should disclose to any potential buyer that you are part of a contamination facility and that your property is subject to court-ordered access for response activities. These are real things that we're facing, and nothing we heard tonight deals with any of that. We're really being greatly burdened here, and I'm sorry to go on so long, but you know, these presentations are very long, and what citizens know about this never gets said. There's a third alternative here that citizens who have been affected by this contamination in the neighborhoods, in my neighborhood and those behind Vets Park, came up with in 2003, when there was a previous proposal by Pall to put a leading edge, quote unquote, and mind you, leading edge is always a guess. It's ephemeral and it's never something certain. They wanted to put this well at Warden and Jackson Place. It was drilled. It's there. They aren't even proposing to use that now. And the group came up with a position statement that I think makes much more sense. We've got to stop chasing edges. We've got to stop chasing plumes. We have to, as this gentleman back here said, concentrate on very upgraded, stepped up mass extraction. And if you look at these maps, the place where they're not doing much of anything and where Larry wants to put a couple of wells is the area with the highest mass of contaminant known now at MW72, just west of the intersection of Jackson Road and I-94, the old Michigan Inn property. That's the highest contamination above what they've just found out at the core. It's 3,000 parts per billion or more. And what we said was that they should concentrate in that industrial corridor from there to Wagner Road. I think the company should invest tens of millions of dollars in a thorough hydrogeologic exploration there and very, very aggressive mass extraction.
Pat, could I ask Larry to respond very specifically to that suggestion? Because that's a very concrete technical proposal that you have, and I think he's here and we're discussing this issue, and I think it would make sense for you to respond to that.
Yeah.
Can I just ask Corey, when you just finish one thing, what is the next step for citizen action? Just complete your...
Well, my neighborhood group is the Wildwood Park Neighborhood Association and the Northwest Coalition of Neighborhoods. And we started work on this back in 1992 when everybody was saying, no, nothing for it. You know, they were going to have a very permissive discharge permit to Honey Creek, and they were going to dump everything from the Evergreens through our storm sewers that leak and so on. And we got together and we looked at all the technical issues, we looked at the legal issues, we looked at the burden that was being placed on our neighborhoods, and we organized, we joined with the city, the county, the township residents. The township residents and the Ann Arbor residents have always been together on this. Well, it's already done. It's an organization that's already in existence. And I think we need to get the city to agree with us. This pipeline idea has come from the city. That was never discussed with citizens. The pipeline out Maple Road and possibly coming into Bandamer Park. I'm not happy about giving this company a straight shot to the Huron River. They have violated every permit they've ever had, including the sanitary sewer permit that they had to use our sewers through our neighborhoods. They were supposed to put in a wet weather flow sensor that would automatically shut off the pump. When they had failed with their remediation, and it was a failure in Evergreen, I'm sure that plume didn't migrate just during the time that they were not re-injecting because their well fouled, and it fouled because they didn't take care of it. But when they wanted to come back and use the sewers again, the city found out they'd never put that pump shut off or the sensor in. The city has to, oversee and enforce permits, and they really aren't up to doing that. There's going to be a treatment system in Maple Village that Larry is hyping. It's a technology that's never been used on this site. They've used UV peroxidation. They've never used ozone peroxidation. The city's done some investigation of the efficacy of that system, and I've never seen anything where it's had to treat the levels that are on the Gelman site. There's one instance where they treated 17 parts per billion to less than 5 parts per billion. Well, I'm sorry, that's not very impressive. So we really don't even know whether that will work. And I'm sorry the city didn't consult us about that, but I do not like the idea of giving them a straight shot to the Huron River above Geddes Pond, above all our recreational waters, above Geddes Pond, which could again be the water supply for the city of Ypsilanti, if that's where their water intakes are. If they decide to go off the Detroit system, they'd go back to Geddes Pond. We'd be letting them go in above that. These things really need to be talked out on a local basis. I mean, I think it's fine to have these sort of technical approaches, but these are very serious issues. I do think that if everybody got together, the city, the county, the citizens, we could make an impression. The DEQ says in its fact sheet that it is committed to a dialogue and a conversation with the public to find out what's publicly acceptable. And I have not heard from one of my neighbors or anybody involved in this in the west side neighborhoods of Ann Arbor who think leading edge remediation, whether it's now in 18 months or any place, anytime else, is acceptable. Because we've never seen any competence for effective and protective remediation on this site at all. And I think the kinds of suggestions for this new approach with very intensive scientific input from I don't know who it's going to be is unlikely to happen. The company has always resisted that. They do enough to stay out of jail. That's what it comes down to, you know? And I'm sorry to have to be so blunt about this. It's very painful for me to sit here after having worked on this for 12 years to have been entirely excluded from any of this work. And actually, I think I have more facts on this than some of the experts that stand up before you. The city was great in 1992. They're very nice people at the city now, but they aren't including citizens in planning what's going to happen to us in our neighborhoods.
Well, hang on a sec. hang on a sec. I beg to differ with that because I'm a citizen and I'm included in this process. Well, because no, I'm not being paid. I'm a volunteer. And I have expertise and I'm contributing it because I'm interested in finding a constructive solution to this problem that impacts my community and my neighborhood as well.
I haven't heard you say a thing about your neighborhood. Not one thing. You know, you're talking about this
Hold on, Pat.
as a
let me
professional,
respond.
as a
Okay, let's not get into
technician.
a shouting match here. I'm
not shouting. I'm trying to express the community's point of view that was expressed in '03, and I think that what you're doing does not reflect that.
I believe that the proposal that MDEQ has tabled is the best and most effective solution to this problem. That's my personal and professional opinion. Many of you may differ with that. Some of you may agree with that. I think there are a number of people who have consistently paid a lot of attention to this problem, have leveled some very important criticisms at all the players in the problem through the years, and have contributed in moving this thing forward. But we have to be very careful here because it is much, much easier to criticize than it is to offer constructive solutions. Now, the one thing I heard you say that was concrete was, I think we should put a well in near monitoring well number 72 and pump where the concentrations are the highest. I disagree with that because this is an ad hoc approach, and this is just the kind of thing that Pall has been criticized for many times in the past. Problems with number one, where's the water going to go? Water disposal is a huge issue here. It's been the limiting factor for a number of years. The MDEQ's proposal addresses that. Maybe citizens were not involved in the way you would like them to be, but citizens can be involved and can take a constructive role, and we can find better processes to do that. The question that you have to respond to now in the next 5 days before the public comment period closes is whether to send MDEQ an email or a letter that is in support of their proposal, with modifications perhaps, or whether to be critical of it. And that's really important because when the MDEQ goes to write their final report and recommendation, they're going to take it into account. And when they go to see the judge, he's going to take it into account.
Take what into account?
The public opinion is expressed either in support or in disagreement with that plan. Hold on, let me finish this thought.
That's what we're proposing, is to disagree with it.
And if you do disagree, then what you've done is essentially halted the process once again. And as you do that, the plume marches on. That's the decision you have to make.
I'm telling you that halting the process that has let this plume march on, we're not talking about a successful effort that now all of a sudden there's a blip in it and the neighbors are, the citizens are coming in and causing a problem. It's the polluter and the DEQ who've caused this problem. We have some right to expect that the oversight of the DEQ will keep this sort of thing from happening. What I'm not suggesting one well at the Michigan Insight. I'm suggesting a very comprehensive hydrogeological investigation to find the pathways to do multiple well mass extraction. I know of a site, a 1,4-dioxane site in North Carolina that's a quarter of the size of this that had 45 purge wells. Of course, it's a different geological situation there, obviously much more stratified. But there's never been enough done at the places where it needs to be done on this site. That's why we've got the problems out here in our neighborhoods. And I think that the city's involvement with the citizens needs to be stepped up. I think if we decide together that we don't like either of these approaches and we want something else, it's our obligation to say that. It isn't something that's obstructive. It may be obstructive to what you're proposing, but it's not obstructive to the public interest.
Yeah, can I jump in here a minute and say that Pat has done great work on this all over the years, and we need some more people to step up, because if you're going to have community involvement, it's going to take more than a handful of people. Let me say something else, too, that what Larry has proposed may, in fact, be the best technical solution. But there's other aspects of the solution that have to be considered, and that's where the community comes in. But even if you just take that and say that might be the best technical solution, we're already seeing indications that that's not going to happen. Because the DEQ has already asked Pall to stop the plume at Wagner Road. And Pall has said, no, we're just going to continue to remove some mass. We agreed to that earlier. Well, the DEQ says, no, you got to stop the plume. And what Pall did is say, no, we'll go to dispute resolution. What does that mean? That means go back before the judge. Well, who's going to get the information before the judge? Is it going to be the DEQ? Is it going to be the citizens intervening? Is it going to be the city of Ann Arbor intervening? I mean, we've got decision makers on this site that don't have all the data. So one of the reasons I'm trying to get this thing moving with meetings like this is to get more people involved so they can see this is not going to go away if we don't have a unified community solution. Now, if you can say that we can, there's some problems with disposal through pipeline, if we can resolve some of those problems, and if we can get the DEQ and the courts and whoever else can control this company to do what's required once and for all instead of playing around with this another 20 years, maybe we can have a good cleanup. But it's going to take some work. And it's going to take some effort on everybody's part.
One of the things that can...
Pat, we got a couple questions here. Yeah, go ahead.
So who set the public comment deadline? So we've got till Monday?
That actually, I think, was set by the judge as part of the his 5-year deadline, and well, the DEQ I think set it because they had to respond to this work plan.
The DEQ doesn't like our conversation.
We're just up the street from the Pall plant.
So, to get the public input, we need longer than Monday.
Can I respond to that?
So
No.
how do we get that?
Let's recognize, first of all, that the DEQ is working under constraint imposed upon them by the judge. They have to be ready to issue a report evaluating the FS by September 1st. They have extended the deadline for public comment once already, as much as they felt comfortable doing. We can argue as to whether that's sufficient or not, but I would say to you that the opportunity for public comment does not stop on August the 9th. The opportunity for public comment continues indefinitely as long as this project is going on. Why should you feel limited communicating to your MDEQ representatives or your city representatives just because of an artificial deadline?
Because the judge is going to order a cleanup plan, that's why.
If you want them to take the comments on board, they need to receive them by August 9th.
Pat, if I could add one thing to what you've said tonight, which I think were really wonderful comments. I think that you have some agreement with the proposal that Larry has put forward and some fundamental disagreements with that proposal. But most of all, I hear from you that you are exceedingly cynical that the proposal, if it is carried out exactly as Larry has described, that it will indeed be carried out, that it won't happen the way it's supposed to happen. Giving, as you've described it, giving Pall a straight shot to the Huron River, how do we know, I think you would ask, that pipe, now that they've got a pipe to the Huron River, indeed has water that it is at the cleanup criterion, or perhaps even lower if the level is lowered. So what I think I'm hearing from you is that you and others in the community need to have greater confidence that whatever plan is put into place, if you are somewhat in agreement with that plan, whatever plan is put in place indeed is implemented and carried out in a proper fashion. And what is needed in order to do that, I think, is a watchdogging process that involves the community, but also involves people with technical expertise. And I think it's really up to, Roger has mentioned this and others have mentioned it as well, it really is going to require a sustained effort on the part of the community to watchdog this process. But My question to you is this. Are you in fundamental, do you have fundamental disagreement with the proposal as posed, as described by TOSC tonight?
Yes.
You do?
Yes, because I think that it involves a shift of, in fact, I brought some photographs of the drilling that took place on Warden and Jackson Place. You know, the representation that the DEQ makes that these are sort of insignificant things beyond the initial drilling is simply not so. The people in the Westover subdivision can tell horror stories about directional drilling there for pipelines and for wells. I think we need to see this in a framework of keeping the burden of cost, risk, and liability with the polluter, with the company, and not shifting it to the public. And that means that mass extraction and remediation needs to happen in areas where the purged water can be piped back to Pall Life Sciences. As a matter of fact, I don't agree with doing anything in Maple Village particularly, but the pipeline from Maple Village back to Pall Life Sciences wouldn't have to encounter an I-94 obstacle. I-94 overpasses Jackson Road just south of that site, and a pipeline could be put out there. If the mass removal and remediation was done in the Wagner to I-94 Jackson Road intersection corridor, there could be a pipeline back to Pall. In the original consent judgment in 1992, the then DNR required that the company develop a plan for groundwater reinjection disposal at the core as well as at the Evergreens. They never did it. The DEQ never made them do it. Roger and I raised so much cane about it for a few years that the DEQ finally asked them for a report, and it was 5 pages of nothing, no science, just a bunch of assertions. We still don't know that they can't do recirculation, groundwater reinjection for purged water disposal at the core. I understand.
Pat, I know I asked you a question, but there is a question that somebody would like to ask at the back, if we may.
But my question is, in this hearing that's scheduled for a month from now, are they choosing between one of these two plans? Is this basically a hearing that's saying the choice is being made, or are they just reviewing it? And what is the opportunity to respond to what's happening there?
You know, that is a question as to the dynamic that'll be present in the court before Judge Shelton on September 8th, I believe it is. And I don't know if anybody in the room is really...
Alternative to their,
right.
Who's proposing that? And where does that proposal lie? Is it just in this?
Well, DEQ is taking into account public comments until this coming Monday is the deadline for public comments. They have until September 1st to present a final feasibility study, a final alternative, and
is that presented back to the public before the judge rules on it?
It is.
It will be presented, I mean, we're going to take the public comments.
Right.
Through August 9th. And then we're going to come up with our decision, we release to everyone.
And you'll release that on September 1st. And then 1 week later, they go before the judge to presumably present that.
So we have until Monday to make, before the decision is made, for our input.
The question is, the folks in this room and others in the community have until Monday to provide public input. And I agree fundamentally with what Larry had to say, that this is an issue that's going to continue to go on. There are some important decisions that are being made at this stage, but this is an issue that's going to continue to go on. Leading edge remediation issues, pipeline construction issues, and the community involvement does not end in any sense with the end of this comment period.
Sir, I wonder if you're being disingenuous. We have a decision that is going to be made. The formal public input to it ends as of Monday. Your continuing public involvement is talking about like a fait accompli. I think
When there's a feasibility study that is presented in a cleanup process like this, there is a formal comment period. This is an unusual step in a cleanup process, and yet I think DEQ would tell you, and I think others in this room would tell you, with varying degrees of acceptability, DEQ has listened in the past or not to the opinions of the community.
Just respond to that. I don't think it is disingenuous. I think the decision that's going to be made by September 1st is the decision on the DEQ's part as to what response they will give to the FS. It's not the decision as to what will ultimately happen. Perhaps that will happen on September 8th when the judge weighs both sides and perhaps indicates a decision. I don't know what will happen on September 8th, but what we're talking about as far as the August 9th deadline is our opportunity to provide our input to the DEQ so that we can influence their decision as to what to publish as their official response to the FS on September 1st.
Let's remember to repeat questions.
I just think, in fairness to those here, that you should address the questions on the board before you entertain more questions from the audience. They've been up there a long time.
All right. We said we would do that, and let's do that very quickly. Sybil? This is Sybil Colin of DEQ.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the public comment period. Yes, as you've heard, there are some constraints on our time frame for responding, and August 9th is the official end of public comment. We are reluctant to extend that formally because that basically gives us about 3 weeks to, we are seriously going to be looking at all the comments, and as you've heard here tonight, the comments range from one end to the other. So we're going to have to figure out what our decision is. It's not going to be an easy decision. So what I'm saying basically is I think you can have some additional time. Because we're going to be making taking these comments into consideration. We're not making a decision on August 10th or August whatever the next working day is. So I would, I understand your frustration, and I know this is a lot of new information, and it's, there's a lot to consider. We are going to take into account your comments, and if August 9th, you still have more things to add after that, we will continue to try to consider additional comments as long as we can, but you have to recognize that we are under this September 1st deadline, and it's going to take a week or two for us to draft our proposal, to get our management to buy into it. This is not, this whole decision is not being made at the district level. We make the recommendation. We're going to our division chief. I don't know how much higher up it's going to go than that, but it takes time. So, I ask that you appreciate our position and give us your comments as quickly as you can. Thank you.
Let's take this suggestion to run through the questions and... Okay, go right ahead.
May I please? I'm Liz Workman. I live at 1942 Jackson Place, and I live next door to the Warden Jackson Avenue purge pump that was placed in January of '03. It took from January 14th until the first week in February to complete that operation, and so I know a little bit about the placement of pumps. I think the unknown here is what bothers a lot of people, and I don't think it would have been impossible to give us an example, whether by video or on your PowerPoint or whatever, of what these pumps actually physically are, what you're going to be living next door to. Secondly, the idea of tearing up my whole neighborhood, putting in pipelines, is disconcerting to me. We are a very concentrated area on your map that's going to be bearing a burden of providing safe water to apparently Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti as well. It is essentially my dog walk area from Glendale up to Doty, so it's a very small area that's talking about having a lot of pumps placed. I think that it would be helpful also for us to know, on my side of town, my neighbors are here, what exactly are we talking about as far as what parts of our neighborhood are going to be torn up with pipeline. Living on Jackson Avenue, we've been frequently reminded that it's an MDOT controlled I-94 corridor. I think that if Jackson Avenue is torn up, this is going to affect all the people from western Washtenaw County on who use this as their thoroughfare to and from Ann Arbor. We experienced Jackson Avenue being torn up for cable placement a few years ago, and know that this significantly impacts on a large volume of traffic that uses this essentially 94 business route, which makes me and my neighbors worry that you're talking about tearing up Jackson Place, which is a smaller than average residential street which runs right into our front yards. So I think some specifics as to what exactly pumps are, what do they look like, what are they like in action, and where exactly is this pipeline going to go, would have been helpful either to assuage some of our concerns or to solidify what I think are genuine residential concerns. Thank you.
Pat has some photographs.
Thank you.
There are photographs of the...
They're my photographs, actually, a lot of them.
Did you write them?
Certainly.
Quickly, besides the description of the pumps, none of us know or understand any risks involved in having a pipeline carrying just right past my front door, carrying 1.4 dioxin to Maple Village. We don't understand what are the risks. Could there be a breakage? Could somebody hit that accidentally at some time? And we know gas lines are hit sometimes accidentally.
The question is, I think we can give you some answer to that question, but I want to repeat the question first, so simply for the recording. What risks are associated with bringing the 1,4-dioxane contaminated groundwater to the surface, pumping it through a pipeline, through a residential neighborhood to a treatment facility, and where the dioxane is oxidized, and then it is the 85 ppb water is then discharged to some other location. What are the risks associated with the withdrawing it from the aquifer at the higher levels?
She's also saying, what do the pumps look like? What do the pipeline laying process looks like?
Right.
What are the securities built into that?
Right.
We're not terrified.
Mike, would you?
It's not going to be great because at the board.
Mike, you got to use
We want to know what they look like.
Well, I mean, actually, as it's been in place at Warden and Jackson, well, there's the Montgomery Well House area, and that's an above ground. Sorry. I'm Michael Gephardt with Washtenaw County Environmental Health. I've been working on this project for about 3 years. Two aspects that it's been done at the Warden and Jackson system, as it's there now with that plastic rock over it, that is the end product. That's after they're done installing it and connecting the pipe, that's connected typically with a pitless adapter, just like a typical rural residential well that's going to be below the frost line and connect up with a subgrade pipe that, as it's been proposed, has been a double-walled polyethylene pipe, so that space between the double wall is something that's going to be monitored, so if that inner pipe breaks, it has both secondary containment and ability to monitor that. In the Evergreen area, extraction wells there. There's some that are operating now. The pipeline's all below grade. That one, it reaches the deeper levels of the aquifer because it's not merely a transmission line, but it's also goes deeper into the aquifer for those extraction wells that Larry represented. So it would most likely be something different than that because it doesn't need to go deep to also include extraction wells. As you've seen some of the monitoring wells on Warden and Vets Park, after the installation is complete, what's left is either a flush grade manhole that's a foot in diameter with, usually they add a concrete pad around it about 2 by 2 to keep that manhole in place. The most invasive part, as she said, is the pipeline installation, the well installation that takes place over a period of time depending on how deep the well is, how large the well, and the one on Warden was a larger diameter well that it took longer to install. But once that well is completed, and that was not merely a well installation, because they also did an aquifer pumping test to determine the hydraulic properties to aid in the process. So, you know, the installations of extraction wells would be more as a part of that overall plan. And as I said, it's conceptual at this point, but you know, generally there are remediation systems installed. I previously worked for an environmental firm and worked at the there was, I believe, it was a Shell site in downtown Ypsi, and the extraction process, the monitoring wells, was in the parking lot across from the Eastern Michigan Business School. That entire system took place and was running for, I think it might actually still be running now, but everything is below grade except for a treatment building that was installed next to a structure. So once the installation's complete, they can be built so that if it has a well house that can be below grade and have like an access manhole that's, you know, 3 by 4, or as is on Warden, there's a short above grade portion that's covered with cosmetic, but most of the connections take place below ground, below the frost line.
Well, let me back up just a second here. Most of the problem is during the construction of it. And if it's, a lot of times when the company goes out to try to get it on private property instead of on public rights of way, so therefore they have no obligation to tell the neighbors. So suddenly a well rig shows up and other trucks and a lot of disruption and stuff. We want to avoid that. There's a way to do this to minimize that. When you have to have a well in someplace, there's a way to minimize it. Now, once it's there, you can see what these look like. You can find the addresses on the websites and find where these wells are. You can call any one of us to find and go visit them. And you can listen. You can, if you get up close to the pump, you can actually hear it hum. But keep in mind, during the construction, they have to run not just the water pipeline to dispose of, but they have to run electricity. In some cases, they have to put another pole in. In some cases, they have to upgrade the service. So if you're ever talking with the company about that, make sure you ask those questions, like, tell me everything that's going to happen so you don't get any surprises. And then tell your neighbors, and do it on a community basis. If we're going to do this right, we're going to know up front, long before any wells go in. And instead of having these things just pop up and never be used. It's crazy.
When they were extracting, is it the same pumping process that they were doing on that Jackson work when they're doing the top?
No, they don't pull it out to a truck. You just hear the...
So you just hear a hum.
Right, hear a hum. Right. You had a question there.
Well, let's go through the questions.
Well, we're not going to get through them all. Maybe what I was going to propose is that people who had their question up here and you think it's relevant to this deadline, we're going to try to answer all these questions eventually on our websites and keep you posted on them. But if you think you have a question here that relates to this deadline and to this plan, if you could say, that was my question, let me re-ask it. That way I think we can get to the important questions. Otherwise, we're just going to be guessing up here. So people that have already had their question up here, I think we should go to first.
Can I ask one question about the safety, you were saying the pipe that sticks up on Warden?
Yeah.
I guess you and I differ on what a small amount above the ground is, because I think a car could hit it. So you said it was surrounded by cement. Now give me the technicals. Let's say Edison is going to dig, and their backhoe hits that pipe, and it breaks it out of the cement. Now tell me what happened.
Essentially, probably nothing at that point, because that well, as I said, there's connections with what's called a pitless adapter. That pitless adapter is located basically below the frost line. Typically, I think we're 42 inches below grade. So that pipe sticks up at probably a foot above grade. And that's one possible installation. It is possible that all that takes place and all that is on the surface is a manhole of some sort, whether it's a round cast iron or a square lid that can be raised to access a pit, basically.
But I'm asking about the one that sticks up.
The one that sticks up, if that's hit, what sticks up is the device that allows for the removal of the pump and disconnection from the pitless adapter, so that's possible to break. I guess it's to what magnitude a backhoe hits it. If a car runs into it, it is a large steel casing that will probably bend in some fashion. I guess it depends on the size of the impact to really quantify it. I mean, if a semi drives over it, it's probably going to tear the top of the wellhead off. That's
What happens? What she's asking the contamination.
Go ahead. It's not. Most of these aren't artesian conditions, so the water's not going to come shooting up. They'll just turn off the pump until they repair it. So
disrupts the wiring of the pump. The pump's not going to no longer function, and the system's going to stop. There will probably be, depending on how the piping's set up, if there's not a check valve, there could be some flow back into the system, into the well, but that would probably be set up with a check valve.
yeah, there's ways to handle it, and that's good that you bring it up because that's the kind of issue that we have to take time to bring up and make sure it's addressed before it's put in. And we haven't had that opportunity to date, and we want that opportunity. Let's have another back there.
No one has asked whether or not an extension could be granted for making this decision. Is it because it's absolutely impossible?
Okay, can an extension be granted for this deadline? And as I understand it, the judge set the hearing, and he wants the decision before the hearing. Could the DEQ ask for an extension of the hearing so we can have a corresponding extension of the deadline? Is that what you're asking?
Do we want to ask MDEQ?
Yeah, Mitch Alleman from MDEQ, do you want to answer that question?
Mitch Edelman with the DEQ's office in Jackson. I guess we could ask the judge for whatever we want, but to clarify what Sybil just said, I'm inclined right now to formally extend the comment deadline till the 16th. That gives you folks an extra week. And Sybil's already extended it from, I think the original day was the 4th or something, but you know, we had hoped that the meeting that TOSC held was going to be held before our meeting last week. It didn't work out that way. So given that, we'll extend it to the 16th, so make sure your comments are postmarked by then. And then beyond that, frankly, I'm reluctant to go to the judge, and I think our attorney is going to be, because I think the judge was pretty clear in that the court wanted a decision made by the next hearing, which is September 8th. So we'll extend it till August 16th, and please, when you submit comments, to the extent
you get that one down there?
You guys have comments about how you want things constructed to pose the minimal amount of disruption to your neighborhoods. Those kind of comments are things that we can take too. I've been involved in constructing some state-funded remediation systems where wells have, as Mike said, everything takes place below grade. You've got vaults that house the well, and the only thing you would see at the top is the access doors, and those can be landscaped to cover around too. So there wouldn't be the risk of somebody hitting something like that with a car. But again, the biggest thing.
6 inches.
Excuse me?
Well, you can't have flowers in your lawn extension.
Well,
extraneous
you know,
comment.
the point I want to make is, if you're, and I don't want to take too much time, but to respond to Pat's, one of the things Pat said earlier, I think one thing DEQ did differently in our proposed remedial alternative than what has been done before, and I understand it's frustrating that this has gone on for a number of years, but we've set performance objectives, and Larry covered it really well, I thought, so that eventually, if our solution gets implemented, the plumes will be split into 3, and hopefully that'll shorten the overall period of time. We haven't, in the past, given them objectives to that case, and yes, monitoring is a critical part of that they're going to have to monitor after they install a system to show that things are going to behave as we expect them to, and if not, then they're going to be required to make them run that way. So
the question was, how do you do performance
Put in
monitoring?
more wells. Yeah, you put in wells to monitor, as Larry said, the static. We would require both physical and chemical monitoring. You got to show that the water levels are behaving as expected and that the chemical levels are behaving as expected. And there's, certainly you go into that expecting an X number of monitor wells, and if things don't behave as expected, you need X plus Y.
I want to know how long it's going to take.
Hold on here. Hold on. We got to keep focused here.
This extension issue, I understand that you don't
So the question was, why can't the citizens ask for an extension if the DEQ doesn't want to ask for one?
Could I make a comment on that, Roger?
Just
Advise every homeowner in that neighborhood what's going on, because we're dependent on newspaper, or word of mouth, as property owners. Who gives you the specifics somewhere?
And there's been a variety of means. I mean, at one point, I think the administrator sent a letter out to a number of people, to homeowners. I mean, to homeowners. And I will, you know, we make choices on how we notify people. And, you know, I guess a lot of, you know, you can ask Pat. Ask Pat if there's ever been a time I haven't responded to a call from her, you know, or Roger. I work on issues,
You
know, I
haven't
go to
returned
meetings
my
with-
calls.
Pardon?
You have not always returned my calls.
Okay, Glenn. But, and I guess we could go through the litany if there's anyone else whose phone call I haven't returned. But I guess there's a number of, and I don't mean to belittle your point, and I think what I hear you saying is there's a group in the community that are now really concerned about this, and that has not been the history in the last 3 years. It ebbs and flows over time, and I go to every meeting every month. And I'm hearing that people are really interested in being involved, and that was one of my questions earlier. How do you want to stay engaged? You know, we can, you know, if you tell me, I think citizens in the city of Ann Arbor need a letter, you know, from the administrator, from me, to know more about this and be made more aware, I can do that. You know,
I believe you
call-
already sent one, Matt, and it said kind of like, don't worry, be happy.
You know, I guess those of you can read the letter and make your own decisions on how that letter was meant. And I'm happy to work with a group of citizens on what the letter should say. Again, I have an email subscription list. That doesn't go to everybody. I try and work with Tracy Davis in the Ann Arbor News and other reporters when new things are coming out to try and reach out to the community. But again, I'm interested in hearing from you on how best we can get the word out. That's a longer term solution.
And if I can throw in my comments on that, I think this is where you guys come in. We got to make sure there's some kind of a group in each neighborhood that's keeping track on this. You need a couple people that are kind of like the point people in the neighborhood to watch out for this, and then they can be the conduit for any of the information flows between letters. I mean, there's things that go on every day or so, and we need to get information out to the community on a timely basis. And the community has to be part of that. You can't rely on, you know, the city sending out a letter every week or every day, every time something happens. You need some point people, you need some key people from this group to get involved, and we're trying to get some mechanisms to do that.
We were just notified by the building folks that we need to be out by 10 o'clock, so we've got about another 15 minutes or so. So I wanted to make sure everybody in the audience knew that.
All right. Now, are there any questions that people asked earlier that we really need to get answered here today?
I have one question that has not been, that is on the board. I would waive that question if I could make just a
12 minutes.
You always got these a little too short. I'd waive that question if I could just make a couple of brief comments here. I think the charge to DQ should not be so much as why can't we extend the comment period. They do have a definite deadline there. The charge should be, why did we wait a year and let Paul try multiple strategies that failed before asking or opening the comment period? The other comment I would like to make is a little bit more directed toward the cleanup itself. Disposal of the water has always been a problem. It is definitely desirable to consider and maintain the idea of reinjection, but I don't think we can rely on it. The DEQ's proposed pipeline is a big step in the right direction. I think you always need that as a backup, regardless of how successful or unsuccessful reinjection may be. The point is, the pipeline should go back to the core. That's where the high concentration is. Yes, it should be used at Maple Village, and it should be used between Maple Village and the core. But the core is where the problem is. It is illogical to pump it a mile and a half into our neighborhood and try to clean it up there. The other thing that is a very significant problem with this is we're dealing with a strong artifact of the 85 ppb. There's nothing scientific about the 85 ppb. That is imposed by the DEQ. It may be formed in the DEQ rules, but these are rules, not law. DEQ promulgated many of those rules under the guidance of the law, but the rules can be waived, modified, or changes can be promulgated. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, just exactly, what is the city's role in this? We're talking about the DEQ and with the judge and making a decision. Ultimately, I foresee the city is like standing off on the sideline, going, you guys figure it out, we'll just kind of go with it. Where is your advocacy for your citizens? Exactly. Can you take what they decide and you have input on it at that point, but the judge decides?
We have some role. I mean, the judge is in charge, and there's a long history here. Any comment, you can go to our website and see that we comment as an official body. I'm part of a technical group that sits down with the DEQ. Paul participated for a long time. They've quit participating. When you go into the courtroom, there's the judge, and there's DEQ, and it's really the Attorney General's office. And that's DEQ's attorney. And there's Paul's attorney. There's no technical staff, no testimony that I've seen in the last 3 years. That's what you see. And that's how the decisions on this site are made. I am not in the courtroom. I don't have an attorney there yet. However, City Council has set aside quite a bit of money. We have recently sued Pall Corporation over the loss of a major piece of infrastructure we have and the need for us to find alternative sources of water. Now, that case was recently filed. That case has been assigned to Judge Shelton, and there may be an opportunity for our voice to be heard in a legal way there. But we haven't had a voice in that courtroom, so we have tried to use other means, like, well, I'm just saying legally, we're not allowed into that courtroom. We've tried to take steps. One of the mechanisms we've used is our political leaders. Liz Brader, Mike Gebhardt and I were talking to Liz Brader about what was going on with the contamination. Senator Brader, set up a meeting with DEQ so that Roger Rail, citizens, local governments, myself, Mike Gebhardt, Sue McCormick, our water director, could meet with Director Chester, his staff, his key deputies, and elevate this, to the DEQ. I think that's the main reason DEQ has made a new proposal, something they don't typically do. So again, am I frustrated that we don't have a direct line and control over this site? Do I wish DEQ was doing all the proposing and controlling the site, or some citizen group that could guide it? Sure. But anyway, so I'm not sure if that answered all of your question.
Ultimately, will the court decision be imposed on the city and the city has to vote?
Well, again, if the court tells us to do something, we have our own legal remedies to say yes or no. I believe that the city, and I would be behind taking court action to stop things that we don't agree on. We did not allow Paul to put the well on Jackson on city right-of-way. We thought it was premature. Paul went ahead and basically put it in a little old lady's front lawn.
Citizens called the city when that was happening, and it happened.
Well, citizens called us. We weren't in a position. She has the right to let Paul put that on her property.
So that can happen on any of these wells?
It can, except the county passed a well ordinance, so now we are notified before any wells are installed on private property.
What leverage do you have to stop it on private property?
We at least have a heads up to talk to the private I can't tell you not to sell your house. I can't tell you not to let Paul I can talk to you and tell you not to do something, but ultimately that's your private property. There are other things I can do, like stop it because of a noise ordinance, stop it because of a dust ordinance.
If it's a hazard to the general public, if there's a potential hazard to the general public, you're saying
Yeah,
that you
no,
have
if,
no right as a governmental body
no,
to stop something like that?
I didn't say that.
I'm asking for clarification.
There are many mechanisms if somebody is posing a hazard to the citizens of Ann Arbor that we can take action.
And there is a potential hazard with the Warden Jackson well, right?
I would argue that that well in and of itself right now is not posing any threat whatsoever to the citizens of Ann Arbor.
Unless it's drawing the
Pumping.
Let's take a couple more questions. We really are very pressed for time, and they would like us out already. So,
We have lots of questions back.
well, I know she had her hand up earlier prior to the question back there.
We spent a lot of time putting the questions up with the understanding that they would get answered.
Oh, I didn't catch that. If there's agreement on running through the questions, but I think what Roger proposed is if your question pertains to this decision making and is not answered, not checked off, then go ahead and ask it again, or simply tell us that it's up there.
I have a question that's not been addressed. It's my understanding that there are locations near the contamination site that have high concentrations that are not included in the cleanup, that are either in like a swampy area or a mixed and ground. Is that an understanding that is correct, or did I get that wrong? Is anybody knowledgeable of that?
Well, there are several areas that, shallower areas in the soil system that have much higher concentrations that are not being addressed. And in fact, the DEQ has said you don't have to do it for the time being. So the idea of continuing sources has always been a problem for us. And
What counts are in that soil?
well, the soils, the last time it was read, was just under 1 million parts per billion.
1 million parts per billion.
Yeah. The person behind you.
This kind of falls with that. This question is up there somewhere, but what studies were done on the efficacy of alleviating the problem at its location, at the core, at Wagner Road? All these, everything we're seeing is what to do down here.
Well, the question was, what studies were done to alleviate the problem at the core? Well, it turns out there was one done in 1988 by the company. Their own internal studies said that they could clean this up in 5 years everywhere to 2 parts per billion or less, and it would cost $44 million. And it would require 301 treatment lamps. And I think that's when the company said, we're not going to do it that way. But, well, it was already, keep in mind, it was already off-site at that time. By the time they discovered this was already off-site.
So why is the DEQ, and this is what I don't get, I mean, I don't keep saying they have to have a proposal. Why aren't they putting forth the best proposal, not one that's just sort of okay?
Why aren't they putting forth the best proposal? The DEQ? Why is the DEQ not putting forth the best proposal?
They have to have a proposal. This is what I don't understand. It sounds like what the DEQ has said, and I have no problem with DEQ in their position, except for they're saying we have to have an answer in front of the judge, whether it's a good one or not. And that seems to me, you know, the answer is to fix it at the source of the problem, unless it's impossible. It's
Right.
not impossible. Why isn't everyone pushing for that answer?
And so the question is, why are they just proposing an answer instead of perhaps the ultimate answer? And remember, this is just for the E unit. This doesn't
Let me
cover
try and
other
address
parts of
that
the
real
cleanup.
quick. As Roger said, what we're talking about in the proposal that DEQ has put forward is for the Unity Aquifer. There's other shallower plumes that are being addressed with separately under the guise of a court and a 5-year plan. With respect to the Unity Aquifer, or the Unity Plume, we agree with Larry that the best way to refer to that is Unity Plume. We think this is the best technical solution. It's going to result in treating stuff near the source by virtue of setting a performance objective near Wagner Road and saying no further eastward migration of concentrations greater than 85. We set another line for hydraulic capture in the vicinity of Wagner Road, or Maple Road, excuse me. And then at the same time, deal with trying to address the leading edge, realizing it's going to take some more time. But we think the interim measures of treatment over in the vicinity of Wagner Road and in Maple Road are the best technical option. And one job that the public has to do, and I think Paul, I mean, we have several issues with the way Paul presented things in the feasibility study. But they did go through a range of options, you know, looking at that well over on Worden Street. When they first pumped that, they put the water in tankers and shipped it back to their treatment plant. That's one way you can move water once you pump it out of the ground. Obviously, nobody wants to see that. Another way is suck it out and put it in a pipeline and take it to where you're going to treat it. They proposed doing that in a couple different locations. We looked at that and said, geez, we think it makes more sense over in the vicinity of the source to pump it to their existing treatment plant in the vicinity of Maple Village area, treat it over there. That way you deal with less pipelines, and so we think that is the best way to deal with the problem that,
I want to say
that we
something.
get.
I just want to add one comment to that. I think this is the best technical solution too. You've already heard me say that. But I think what Paul has proposed in Alternative 6 is essentially a gamble. They're asking us as a community to allow the plume to migrate to the Huron River, and they're promising to clean it up when it gets there in the end. And in response, or the payoff for us for accepting that gamble, is less disruption to the neighborhoods. And that's a real, tangible impact on a small group of people. That's what we have to weigh. I think there's a lot of agreement in here, in the room, that mass has to be removed and we have to get it out of the system. You don't have to agree with every element of this plan. Maybe you can agree with a part of it. Maybe it makes sense to you to have extraction wells along Wagner Road to prevent further migration of 1,4-dioxane off the site and farther to the east. Maybe it makes sense, or maybe it doesn't, to have a bank of extraction wells along Maple Road to prevent the highest contaminations in the E-plume from moving farther to the east. And maybe it makes sense to you to have extraction wells at or near the leading edge to prevent it from moving farther to the east and ultimately to the river, or maybe it doesn't. I think it's really important that you think about what the options are, what the impacts are going to be, and make your comments to the DEQ so they can take them on board. That's the best way to influence the process in the short term.
And I think just to add to that, what assurances are we going to have that even if a best solution is identified, that all these other considerations, the legal, the community, how are we going to know that it actually gets implemented? How are we going to know that the DEQ is going to follow through on this and not let the company slide by like has happened in sometime in the past? Fred, did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. With the increased heads at the river caused by the pond system down there, isn't it likely that rather than the plume moving where Paul suggests, that it will probably move farther downstream somewhere or go under the river and thereby affect the actual drinking water wells of residents of the area?
Yeah, I have a few slides, but we don't have time to illustrate that. I think there's really three possibilities. When the plume, if the plume, and when the plume gets to the river, it can either cross under the river and keep on going. Highly unlikely. Why? Because we've already got groundwater moving to the river from the other direction. There's elevation up here. Water flows downhill and groundwater is flowing toward the river as well. That's going to interfere with each other. It's possible, but not probable. 2, the water discharges into the river. That's possible. It depends on the relative head relationship between the head of the river surface and the piezometric surface below. Third possibility, and probably without any data, probably very likely, is when it gets to the river, it's going to travel under the river and move down along the river surface toward this bank of wells. I think that's a very real possibility that can't be ruled out at this time, and we need more information about the relationship between the river and the aquifer system below it before we can address that question with any degree of certainty.
We really do need to go.
I guess they really do need us to go, and I apologize for that. I will offer to set up another meeting for next week. We will post it on the city's website. Ideally, it's going to be on the front page. Go ahead. I will also notify everyone who is signed up. Ideally, if you've got email, we'll send it out to you. If we have to make phone calls, we will. Again, we'll try and set it up for Wednesday, Thursday, something like that.